Hey, welcome back, friend. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Genuinely glad. There is something about knowing that someone somewhere has decided to set down whatever the day handed them and just rest for a while that I find quietly wonderful. So thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing this. Go ahead and get comfortable. If you're in bed, pull the blanket up a little. If it slipped down one side, go ahead and sort that now. I'll wait. If you're on a sofa or in a chair or sitting somewhere quiet with your headphones in, just let your body settle into whatever position it finds. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw release. Let the small, persistent tension that lives somewhere between your eyes and the back of your neck just ease very slightly. You don't have to force it. Just let it. There is nowhere you need to be tonight. There is nothing waiting for you that cannot wait until tomorrow. Whatever is sitting in your mind, whatever list, whatever worry, whatever half-finished thought has been following you around all day, you can set it down here, at the door, and come inside without it. It will still be there in the morning. Tonight is not for it. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere. Somewhere specific, somewhere particular, a time and a place with its own light and its own sounds and its own very particular set of obsessions. Because every era has its obsessions, and the Victorians, as obsessions go, were remarkable people. Tonight we are going to talk about ankles. I know. Stay with me. We're going to talk about what ankles meant, specifically what a woman's ankle meant, in the long, formal, elaborately constructed world of Victorian England, what they represented, what they were capable of producing in the minds and the private writings and the quietly loaded attention of Victorian men, what the seeing of one, briefly, accidentally, for perhaps 2 seconds on a busy London pavement, could actually do to a person who lived inside the rules of that particular world. Because here is the thing, and I want you to hold this, because it is the centre of everything we're going to discuss tonight. In the Victorian era, in the long middle decades of the 19th century, roughly from the 1840s through to the 1890s, those high, formal years when Queen Victoria was on the throne, and England believed itself to be at the centre of the civilized world, the sight of a woman's ankle was considered one of the most remarkable things a man could witness in the course of an ordinary day. Not just attractive, not just pleasant, remarkable. The kind of thing that appeared in private diaries, the kind of thing that shaped sentences in novels with all the careful, sideways, deliberately restrained language that Victorian writers used when approaching something they could not quite say directly. The kind of thing that generated, in the men who saw it, a response that was clearly and significantly out of proportion to the physical fact of what was actually being seen. An ankle, one ankle, the joint between the foot and the leg, the narrow section of the lower limb just above the boot, just below the place where the stocking disappeared under the hem, a glimpse, a second or two, a fraction of an inch of pale white cotton visible between the leather of the boot and the heavy darkness of the falling skirt. This was, by the documented consensus of Victorian men who wrote about it at all, extraordinary. And tonight, we are going to find out why. We have all the time in the world. Let us begin on a street. Let us begin in London, in the autumn of 1872. Not in a great house, not in a palace, not in the kind of formal interior that Victorian painting so often chose as their setting. Let us begin in the open air, on the pavement of a wide, well-kept thoroughfare, somewhere like Oxford Street, or perhaps Regent Street, one of those broad commercial avenues that cut through the West End of London and served as the public stage for the daily performance of respectable life. It is afternoon, a Tuesday in October. The morning's rain has cleared, mostly. The sky is the colour of pewter now, that particular flat, diffuse grey that London wore for most of the autumn months, and the pavement is still faintly damp in the sheltered spots where the sun has not yet reached it. There is coal smoke in the air. You can taste it at the back of your throat, a metallic edge, a slightly sulphurous quality that was so constant and so universal in Victorian London that most people had simply stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the particular smell of your own home after a week. There is the smell of horse, warm and slightly sharp, because the streets are full of horses, because horses are the engine of the Victorian city, and the smell of them is everywhere. There is the smell of wet stone. There is, from somewhere nearby, the warm yeasty drift of a bakery or a coffee house. And there is sound. This is what hits you first, if you have come from somewhere quiet. The Victorian street is loud in a way that is difficult to convey from the outside. Iron wheels on stone sets, the particular crashing, grinding, clattering rhythm of carriage wheels on uneven stone, continuous, relentless. Horses' hooves, hundreds of them, a sound that blends into a kind of constant low percussion. The shouts of coachmen, the calls of street sellers working the gutters, hot chestnuts, matches, newspapers, lavender, bootlaces, the low, steady, overlapping murmur of hundreds of private conversations happening simultaneously, none of them quite audible, all of them contributing to a background hum that is the living sound of a city going about its business. And through this noise, through this crowd, through this thick, layered sensory density that is an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Victorian London, women are walking. This is what you notice when you look. Not the carriages, not the shop fronts with their gilt lettering and their gas-lit interiors, not the crossing sweepers working the intersections with their brooms. What you notice is the women. Because they are extraordinary to look at in 1872, and they are everywhere. They are dressed in the fashion of the moment, which means they are wearing a remarkable amount of fabric. The skirts are long, floor length, dragging slightly at the back hem in some cases, fitted at the front and sides and then flaring out behind in a fullness that will, in a few years, evolve into the pronounced bustle shape of the late 1870s and 1880s. The skirts are supported underneath by layers of petticoat, stiffened cotton, sometimes flannel in the colder months, arranged in careful sequence to produce the desired silhouette. The fabrics are heavy, wool twill, in deep navy or bottle green, or charcoal grey, or the rich burgundy that is fashionable this season. Silk for those who can afford it, good cotton for those who cannot. Above the skirts, fitted bodices, every button done. High collars trimmed with a narrow band of lace or a small pin, sleeves tight to the wrist, hair pinned firmly up and back, hidden under hats of various sizes, some large and elaborate, some small and precisely placed, all of them chosen with the particular care that Victorians brought to every visible aspect of appearance, because appearance was not decoration in 1872. Appearance was information. Appearance was legible, and people read it. This is the surface of the Victorian street. This is what is visible, what is permitted, what is presented to the world as the correct and appropriate image of respectable female life. And then there is the hem, the very bottom of the skirt, the place where the heavy fabric meets the pavement, the edge of the garment moving with each step, tracing its complicated arc across the stone, sometimes dragging, sometimes lifting, fractionally as the stride extends or the wind shifts or a step is navigated. This is where the Victorian street became interesting. Because if you watched carefully, if you were standing at the right angle, if the light was right, if a woman walked quickly or mounted a step or turned sharply at a corner, or hitched her skirt the inch or two necessary to negotiate the puddle that had collected at the low point of the curb, you might see the toe of her boot. The narrow, close-fitted toe of a well-made boot, leather gleaming dark in the afternoon light. The curve of the instep, the side of the ankle, a thin line of white stocking above the boot's topmost button, a glimpse, 2 seconds perhaps, then the hem settled. The woman walked on. The moment was over, and this, in the world of 1872, was something, not a scandal, not a crisis, not even precisely a notable event, but something, a charged something, a particular kind of small, precise, momentary thing that landed differently from the surrounding noise and movement of the street. That was filed away, noted, remembered with a specificity that the other details of the walk home did not receive. Why? Why this and not something else? That is the question. And the answer is, as answers often are, not simple. The answer requires us to go back a little. It requires us to understand how we got here, how the Victorian ankle became the thing it was. Because it was not always this charged, this weighted with meaning, this capable of doing what it did. The ankle had a history, and that history is where we need to begin. The history of the Victorian ankle begins more or less in the Regency. The Regency era, the years between roughly 1811 and 1820, when the Prince of Wales acted as regent for his ailing father, King George III, was an era of a particular kind of fashion. Not the fashion of 1872, something quite different. Something, in fact, that would have been entirely unrecognisable to the women walking down Oxford Street in our October afternoon. The Regency silhouette was the column, the high-waisted, narrow gown that fell more or less straight from just below the bust to the floor. The waistline sat at the natural empire point, high up on the torso just beneath the bust, and from there the fabric fell loosely, softly, without significant shaping. The skirts were not structured. They were not supported by multiple petticoats or internal frames. They simply fell in the way that fabric falls when it is left to its own gravity. And the fabrics themselves were light. This is important. Muslin was fashionable in the Regency at its most fashionable extreme. A fine, sometimes almost transparent cotton weave, soft and flowing and deeply impractical in the English climate, which is precisely why it was fashionable. White was the preferred colour, or very pale shades of cream, or the most delicate pink or blue. The look, at its most stylish expression, was of something almost classical, a reference to the draped figures of ancient Greek and Roman sculpture that had become fashionable as a cultural ideal in the aftermath of the Grand Tour and the excavations at Pompeii. At its most extreme, Regency fashion was almost transparent. Thin layers, sometimes a single layer of fine cotton with relatively little beneath it. There were stories, probably somewhat exaggerated but not entirely fabricated, of Regency ladies dampening their muslins so that the fabric would cling more closely to the body. Whether or not this happened regularly, the silhouette aspired to a kind of classical fluidity that Victorian fashion would, within 2 decades, completely abandon. In this context, the ankle was unremarkable. The Regency hem hovered somewhere between the floor and the mid-calf, depending on the fashion of the moment and the occasion. For walking outdoors, for active movement, for the practical negotiation of pavements and parks, the hem was often a few inches above the ground. The ankle was simply visible. It was part of the picture. It was there, unremarked upon, as much a feature of the visible female form as the wrist or the forearm, both of which, by the standards of later decades, were also rather casually displayed. This was not considered improper. This was simply how women dressed. The standards of Regency modesty were different from Victorian modesty in ways that the Victorians themselves would later find somewhat shocking if they thought about it, which most of them preferred not to. And then, across the 1830s and into the 1840s, something began to happen. The silhouette changed, not suddenly, not in a single season. Fashion never changes suddenly. It changes gradually, through the accumulation of small shifts, each one individually imperceptible, each one moving in the same direction, until one day you look back at the fashions of 10 years ago, and they seem to belong to a different world. This is what happened in the 1830s and 1840s. Each season, the waistline dropped a little, away from the Regency Empire line, back toward the natural waist. Each season, the sleeves grew a little larger. The famous gio or leg of mutton sleeve, which inflated the upper arm to enormous proportions in the mid-1830s before collapsing back to something narrower by the 1840s. Each season, the skirts grew a little fuller, a little more structured, a little more supported by the layers of stiffened petticoat beneath them, and each season the hem came down a little further, until by the early 1840s the fashionable woman's skirt was touching the ground. Completely, without exception. The ankle had disappeared, not gradually disappearing, completely, definitively gone. The hem of the 1840s dress lay on the floor. It swept the floor as the woman walked. It collected the dust of the pavement and the mud of the unpaved road and the moisture of the damp stone with complete democratic efficiency. The ankle was not partially hidden. It was not mostly hidden. It was gone, as thoroughly as if it had never existed, behind a wall of fabric that extended from the waist to the ground without a single point of interruption. And into this absence, desire moved. This is the mechanism. This is the essential dynamic that drove everything we're going to discuss tonight. The ankle did not become significant because of anything inherent to the ankle. It became significant because of its disappearance. The concealment created the charge. The absence created the meaning. The hem created the ankle, not in the physical sense, obviously, but in the cultural sense, in the sense that matters for our purposes. The Victorian ankle existed as a culturally significant object because and only because the Victorian skirt concealed it, and the concealment across the 1840s and into the 1850s became even more complete, because in 1856 a development arrived that changed the landscape of Victorian women's fashion with a completeness that no one at the time quite anticipated. The cage crin. Before the cage crinoline, the fullness of the Victorian skirt was achieved through layers of petticoat. This was the standard method. A respectable woman in the early 1850s wore multiple petticoats, sometimes as many as 6 or 7, each one stiffened with starch or flannel or horsehair, each one adding its contribution to the overall volume of the skirt. The weight of this was considerable. A woman in full dress in 1854 was carrying perhaps 8 or 10 pounds of fabric around her lower body, more in winter when the petticoats were heavier wool. The movement this produced was a particular kind of heavy, swaying walk that Victorian women developed as a practical adaptation to the weight of what they were wearing. The cage crinoline replaced all of this with something much lighter and much more dramatic. It was essentially a petticoat made of steel hoops, concentric rings of lightweight steel connected by vertical tapes that could be worn as a single undergarment and produce the same domed fullness as 6 petticoats at a fraction of the weight. The result was immediately wildly popular. By 1857, 1858, the cage crinoline was ubiquitous. Every woman who could afford one wore one. The effect on the silhouette was extraordinary. The crinoline skirt, at its fullest expression in the late 1850s and early 1860s, extended as much as 6 feet in diameter from the wearer's body. The woman inside it occupied an enormous amount of horizontal space. She required a clear arc of 6 feet around her to walk without impediment. She could not sit in a standard chair without the front of the crinoline rising alarmingly. She could not pass through a doorway that was designed for the pre-crinoline human body without turning sideways. She could not sit in a carriage alongside another crinoline-wearing woman without the combined dome of their skirts pressing against the ceiling. She could not lean forward without the back of the crinoline tilting upward behind her, in a manner that required either someone to hold it down or considerable personal adjustment. All of this is well documented. The practical difficulties of the crinoline are one of the great comic themes of Victorian social history, and the Victorians themselves were aware of the comedy. Punch ran cartoons about it throughout the 1860s, and the cartoons were funny because the problems they depicted were real. But what the crinoline also did, what its extraordinary dome of fabric guaranteed without exception, in all conditions and circumstances, was to make the lower half of the female body completely, definitively, and visually absolutely inaccessible. The 6-foot dome of the crinoline skirt was not just concealing the ankle, it was creating a kind of exclusion zone around the lower body, a fabric fortress, a declaration in stiffened cotton and steel that the territory beneath was simply not part of the visible world. And within that exclusion zone, the ankle became mythological, not literally, but in the way that things become mythological when they are reliably inaccessible. They grow in the imagination into something larger than they could ever be in reality. The Victorian ankle, during the crinoline years, was not merely the joint between the foot and the leg. It was the limit of the known world. It was the edge of the map. Beyond the hem was here be dragons, or rather, here be the lower extremities of women, unseen, unimaginable, the most protected and therefore the most imagined territory in the Victorian landscape. When the crinoline began to give way, in the later 1860s, to the slightly less extravagant bustle silhouette of the 1870s, when the skirt narrowed at the front and sides, pulling back, concentrating its fullness at the rear, making the hem a little more navigable than it had been in the dome years. This was the context into which those small moments of ankle visibility fell. The context of the crinoline, the context of everything below the hem having been completely invisible for more than a decade. The woman stepping around the puddle in our October 1872 street scene was stepping out of 30 years of systematically total concealment, and the ankle she briefly revealed was carrying all of that history behind it. No wonder it was remarkable. No wonder it was remembered. There is something else that shaped the Victorian relationship with the ankle, something that operated alongside the history of fashion, but was not reducible to it. And I want to spend a moment here before we move forward, because this something is important. It is in fact the central mechanism of the whole story. The Victorians were, as a society and as a culture, deeply invested in the project of respectability. This word, respectability, does not quite carry for us the weight it carried for them. For us, respectability is a relatively mild quality, a middle-of-the-road virtue, something we associate with paying our bills on time and not swearing in front of neighbours. For the Victorians, particularly for the Victorian middle classes who were the dominant cultural force of the era, respectability was something closer to a religious commitment, a moral position, a daily, active, demanding discipline that governed not just the large choices of life, who you married, how you earned your money, which church you attended, but the small ones too, what you said and how you said it, what you wore and how you wore it, where you went and who you were seen with there, how you moved through public space, how you spoke of other people, what you read, what music you played, what you laughed at. Respectability for the Victorian middle class was not a passive state. It was a practice. It required effort and vigilance and the continuous management of one's visible self. And for women particularly, it was the central organizing principle of social existence. The respectable Victorian woman was modest. The respectable Victorian woman was contained. The respectable Victorian woman presented at all times and in all public contexts a surface that was smooth and controlled and gave nothing away. Not physical information, not emotional volatility, not any evidence of inner experience that had not been pre-approved by the codes of the world she inhabited. The long skirt was not simply fashion. It was part of this project. It was the physical expression of modesty in fabric. The hem on the floor was a material statement about the kind of woman who wore it. To show the ankle, in this context, was not just to reveal a joint. It was to create a breach in a wall. It was to allow the eye to pass beneath the surface of the controlled, respectable, carefully managed exterior into the territory that the exterior existed specifically to conceal. And this breach, brief, accidental, entirely ordinary in its physical cause, acquired an intensity of meaning from the solidity of the wall that surrounded it. The ankle was only remarkable because everything else was so thoroughly not. This is the thing I want you to carry with you as we move through the rest of tonight's story. The obsession with the ankle was not about the ankle. It was about the wall. It was about everything the wall represented. The entire Victorian architecture of female respectability, the decades of systematic concealment, the cultural commitment to the idea that the female body below the waist was a private and inaccessible world. The ankle was the one small place where that world briefly, accidentally, legitimately touched the surface, and a touch, when everything else is sealed, is everything. We're going to explore that touch tonight, from every angle. In every context where the Victorian ankle appeared, the street, the ballroom, the skating pond, the cricket ground, the bootmaker's shop, the theatre, the private diary, the fashionable novel, the anxious advice column. We're going to look at what it meant, how it was managed, who it affected and how, and what happened when. Eventually the wall came down and the ankle was simply an ankle again. There is a great deal to see. Let us keep going. Let us talk about boots. Because you cannot understand the Victorian ankle without understanding the Victorian boot. And the Victorian boot, it turns out, is one of the most extraordinary objects that the 19th century produced. Not extraordinary in the way that the steam engine is extraordinary, or the telegraph, or the railway bridge. Extraordinary in a quieter, more intimate way. Extraordinary in the way that something small and close-fitting and exquisitely made for a specific human body is always inherently extraordinary. The Victorian women's boot was a work of craft, a serious one. It was not simply a shoe with a higher side. It was a precisely engineered garment for the foot, designed to do several things simultaneously, and to do all of them without any visible evidence of effort. First, it needed to protect the foot. The Victorian street was not a clean environment. The pavement where there was pavement was stone, uneven, wet in rain, muddy at the edges, scattered with the debris of a city running entirely on horses and coal. The boot needed to keep the foot dry, to prevent the stone's cold from transmitting through the sole, to hold the foot secure over uneven terrain. Second, it needed to present the foot, and this second requirement, is the one that matters for our story. Because the Victorian boot, precisely because it was the only part of the lower body that was routinely visible, was required to do a representational job of great importance. The boot stood in, visually, for the entire concealed territory of the lower limb. The boot was the ambassador from the hidden world beneath the skirt, and like all ambassadors, it was expected to represent its country with precision and distinction. A well-made Victorian boot was fitted to the individual foot with a care that would now associate with the most expensive bespoke clothing. The leather was chosen for quality, kid leather for best boots, a soft, fine-grained skin that was supple and close, that took a high polish and held its shape over years of careful wearing. The cut was narrow, the toe was pointed, not absurdly so, but with an elegance that tapered the foot toward its end in a line that was considered aesthetically correct. The heel was modest, a small lift, perhaps an inch, that altered the posture and the gait in the particular way that Victorian women's ideal movement required. The boot closed down its inner side with buttons. This is a detail worth dwelling on. Not laces, not buckles, not a zip. Buttons, a row of them, sometimes 10, sometimes 12 or more, beginning at the ankle and proceeding down to the vamp of the shoe, each one requiring to be fastened individually through its corresponding loop using a purpose-built instrument called a button hook. The button hook was a slender metal tool, usually with an ivory or bone handle, sometimes silver for the wealthy, with a hook at one end that was designed to thread through the button loop, catch the button, and pull it through. The process of doing up a pair of boots in the morning was a quiet, methodical, somewhat meditative task that took several minutes even for a practiced hand, and considerably longer for a tired one, or a cold one, or one whose button hook had been misplaced. Every morning, in every middle-class Victorian household in England, the ritual of the boots happened. Sometimes a lady's maid performed it, kneeling on the floor with the button hook while her mistress sat in a chair and offered her foot. In less prosperous households, women did it themselves, bending forward with the hook, working from ankle to toe, button by button. The boots went on every morning and came off every evening, and the going on and coming off required this specific, physical, intimate attention to the ankle and the foot that no other item of dress required in quite the same way. The finished boot was perfect, tight, smooth, showing the shape of the foot through the leather with a precision that left nothing to mystery. The curve of the instep clearly visible, the narrow ankle indicated by the narrowing of the leather just above the last button, the slight flare at the heel, the fine seam down the centre of the toe cap lying straight as a plumb line. The boot was information. It told you, if you knew how to read it, a great deal about the foot it contained. And it told you, this is the crucial thing, where the foot ended and the ankle began. It traced the boundary. It marked the edge of the visible world. A well-fitted boot on a well-shaped foot was considered, in Victorian social aesthetics, a very significant thing. Not something you spoke of directly, not something that appeared in polite conversation as an explicit subject of admiration, but significant nonetheless in the way that everything significant in the Victorian world operated at a slight angle in the half-light of implication, observed and noted and remembered without any formal acknowledgement that the observing and noting had occurred. Victorian women were aware of this. They were aware of their boots as a representational object in a way that is difficult to fully convey without living inside the cultural logic of the era. The boot was chosen carefully. The bootmaker was selected with the same consideration that went into the selection of a dressmaker. The fit was checked, the leather was examined, the colour was considered. This was not vanity precisely, or rather, it was vanity of a kind that was considered entirely appropriate. Because the boot was the one item of dress that everyone could legitimately look at, and it was therefore the one item of dress that bore the full burden of representing everything beneath it. The bootmaker's shop. Let us go inside for a moment. Let us step off our October street, push open the door of a bootmaker's premises on one of the side streets near the main commercial thoroughfare. Not the grandest establishment, not the luxury bootmaker who supplied the aristocracy, but a good solid middle-class workshop, the kind that occupied the ground floor of a narrow Georgian terraced building with a window full of sample boots and a small brass plate beside the door. The smell inside is immediate and specific. Leather, warm, rich, faintly animal, the smell of the hide stored in the back room and the cut pieces on the workbench, and the finished boots on the display shelves. Beeswax polish, a faint chemical edge from the adhesives used in construction. The particular dry, papery smell of shoe lasts. The wooden foot forms on which the boots are shaped, stacked in various sizes on shelves along one wall, a row of disembodied wooden feet in graduated sizes that always produced, in first-time visitors, a faintly disconcerting impression. The shop is staffed by a man of perhaps 50, the bootmaker himself, or his senior assistant, and a younger man who does the measuring and the preliminary fitting. There are chairs for customers, set against one wall, low and cushioned, positioned so that the foot can be easily accessed from the floor. There is a measuring device, a flat wooden board with a scale along its length for foot measurements, and a flexible tape for circumference measurements at the widest point of the foot and at the ankle. A woman comes in. She's here to be measured for new boots. Her winter boots, let us say, the heavier pair she will need for the colder months ahead. She sits in the chair. She's accompanied, as a respectable woman always was when making commercial visits of this kind, by a companion, a sister, a friend, her maid. She does not come alone. Respectable Victorian women did not make commercial visits alone if they could avoid it, and a bootmaker's, with its particular requirement of close physical attention to the foot and ankle, was especially a place where the companion was expected to be present. The young man kneels on the floor. He is experienced. He is professional. His manner is entirely impeccably correct, focused, efficient, uninflected. He removes the measuring board from beneath the counter. He asks the woman to extend her foot, which is still in its boot. He places the board beneath it and reads the length measurement, which he notes in a small book. He picks up the tape and asks with perfect formality to take the circumference measurement. He measures the widest point of the foot. He moves the tape upward, measuring the instep, then the ankle. The tape goes around the ankle. The bootmaker's assistant holds it level, reads the measurement, notes it, thanks the woman, and moves on to the other foot. The entire process takes perhaps 2 minutes. Nothing improper occurs. Nothing improper is said. The measurements are taken with complete professional detachment, noted accurately, and will be used to cut the pattern for a boot that will fit perfectly. But the ankle has been measured. The ankle has been touched. Not by the hand. The tape is the intermediary, but touched in the sense of attended to specifically and deliberately. The ankle has been the object of professional, technical, necessary attention, and that attention has produced as its result a precise numerical description of the ankle's circumference. In a world where the ankle was otherwise completely invisible, this was a transaction of considerable specificity. The bootmaker's shop was one of the only places in Victorian society where the ankle entered commercial life at all, where it was, formally and by mutual consent, attended to. The boot that came back a week later, fitted with care and holding the shape of that particular ankle precisely in its leather. This boot was, in a sense, a portrait of the ankle it concealed, a portrait made from the outside in, a record of the thing it covered. Let us go back outside. The October afternoon is still there, still grey, still damp at the edges. We're back on the wide pavement of the main thoroughfare, and we're watching again. Watching the women walk. Walking, for a Victorian woman in a floor-length skirt, was a learned skill. Not in the sense that walking itself required learning, obviously not. But the particular way of walking in the particular clothes of the era required specific adaptation, and that adaptation produced a movement that was distinctive, recognizable, and aesthetically particular. The hem was the governing fact of Victorian female walking. The hem touched the floor. The hem could not be lifted in ordinary circumstances without attracting attention, because lifting the hem was exactly the action that produced the ankle's visibility, and lifting the hem casually without cause was not something that a respectable woman did. And so the hem was left to manage its relationship with the floor on its own, which required that the stride be adjusted to prevent stepping on the hem at the front, and to prevent the fabric from tangling between the feet, and to maintain the particular flowing movement of the skirt that was considered aesthetically correct. The result was that Victorian women walked with a specific quality of movement. The stride was not long. A long stride in a floor-length skirt produced problems. The foot could press against the hem on the forward kick, pushing the fabric forward in a manner that was both ungainly and practically inconvenient. The stride was contained, measured. The weight was distributed carefully, moved from the back foot to the front in a smooth transfer that kept the skirt moving steadily and prevented lurching. The upper body was held erect. The corset, which was worn by virtually all respectable women of the era, enforced this, preventing the torso from bending at the waist and therefore requiring that posture be maintained through position rather than active muscular effort. The carriage of a Victorian woman on the street was consequently rather formal, upright, contained. The movement was from the lower leg and foot. The upper body, and particularly the head, remained relatively still. The effect at its best was of something smoothly propelled, a quality of movement that Victorian commentators sometimes described as gliding, and that was achieved through the combination of the constrained stride, the erect posture, and the long skirt's concealment of the mechanics beneath. The mechanics beneath, the feet, the ankles, the actual physical engine of the movement, the lifting and placing of feet, the flexing of ankles, the push from the rear foot that produced each step. All of this was completely invisible. The woman appeared to move as a whole. The skirt preserved the illusion. And this illusion of movement without visible means, of forward progress without any apparent mechanism, of a human being travelling across space as though on invisible wheels, was itself part of the aesthetic of Victorian femininity. Victorian women were not supposed to appear to move on feet. This sounds absurd, stated that baldly. But it is documented in the conduct books, in the etiquette manuals, in the endless advice literature for women that the Victorians produced in such extraordinary quantities. A lady's movement should be smooth. A lady should never be seen to stride. A lady should never allow her feet to be conspicuous in her walking. The ideal was a movement so controlled, so contained, so perfected that the physical mechanics of it were invisible. And this is why the ankle, when it appeared, was so striking, because it was the mechanism made briefly visible. It was the engine showing for a second from beneath the machine. It was the physical reality, the actual foot, the actual ankle, the actual working joint of a human body in motion, appearing through the gap in the aesthetic. The gap was the point. The gap, brief and accidental and always justified by some external necessity, the puddle, the curb, the step, the wind, was the only place where the Victorian woman's actual physical body made contact with the visible world. Let us think about the puddle more carefully, because the puddle is important, and I think it deserves its own moment. The puddle, or the curb, or the step, or the omnibus platform, was the great legitimizing circumstance of the Victorian ankle's appearance. It was the justification that made the visibility of the ankle acceptable, that placed it outside the category of immodesty, that allowed both the woman who showed and the man who saw to proceed as though nothing remarkable had happened. Here is the thing about the puddle. The puddle was genuinely necessary. You cannot walk through a puddle in a floor-length skirt without soaking the hem. You cannot allow the hem to get soaked, because a soaked hem is both uncomfortable and damaging to the fabric. The practical solution is to raise the skirt. Raise it enough to clear the puddle. This is obvious. This is unavoidable. This is, as far as everyone is concerned, entirely unremarkable. A simple piece of practical management. The kind of thing that any sensible person would do, except that it produces the ankle, and everyone knows that it produces the ankle, and everyone involved in the situation, the woman doing the raising, the man or men watching the street, is fully aware that the puddle has produced the ankle, and that the ankle is visible, and that this is happening. What the puddle provides is deniability. Comfortable, mutual, entirely useful deniability. The ankle is visible, but it is visible for a reason. The reason is the puddle. The reason is practical and legitimate and has nothing whatever to do with any desire to show or any desire to see. The puddle has made it necessary. The ankle has appeared, regrettably but unavoidably, as a consequence of the puddle. This means that both parties can acknowledge the situation without acknowledging it. The woman can raise her skirt and navigate the puddle and lower her skirt and continue walking without any evidence on her face or in her manner that she is aware of having been observed. The man can observe and note and file the observation away without any obligation to respond to it, to speak of it, to acknowledge in any external way that he has seen anything at all. The puddle has provided the cover for both of them, and this cover was essential. This is not a trivial point. The Victorian social world was deeply committed to the maintenance of surfaces, to the performance of not noticing things that were noticed, not seeing things that were seen, not knowing things that were known. The ability to see something and proceed as though you had not seen it was a social skill of considerable importance. The puddle made this possible in the particular case of the ankle. Without the puddle, without some equivalent external necessity, the ankle had no legitimate way of appearing in public, and so the puddle became, in a sense, a necessary partner of the ankle. The ankle needed a reason. The puddle provided one. Victorian rainy weather was consequently very useful. The autumn and winter months, when puddles were constant and the management of hems was a daily practical challenge, were also the months during which the ankle was most visible. This is not a coincidence. It is cause and effect. More puddles meant more opportunities for the practical management of hems. More opportunities for the practical management of hems meant more moments of ankle visibility. More moments of ankle visibility meant more to write about in private diaries, more to notice and file away, more material for the particular kind of charged attention that the Victorian ankle generated. Spring and summer brought their own opportunities, dry pavements certainly, but also the question of the step, the curb, the omnibus. The omnibus in particular was a productive site of ankle visibility. The Victorian omnibus was an open vehicle that required passengers to climb up a steep external step to board. The step was high. The skirt was long. The combination was, from the point of view of hem management, challenging. Every woman who boarded an omnibus had to raise her skirt enough to lift her foot to the step, which meant the ankle was visible to anyone standing at street level, which is to say, to everyone behind her in the queue. The omnibus queue was consequently a location of some interest in the Victorian social landscape. It is mentioned, with the particular oblique sideways attention of Victorian social commentary, in various accounts of street life. It is depicted in illustrations with a consistency that suggests the depictors knew exactly what they were depicting and chose to depict it anyway, because the omnibus boarding was legitimate, and so the ankle was legitimate, and so the illustration was legitimate, and so everyone could enjoy looking at it without anyone having to say what they were looking at. The architecture of Victorian public life was, in this sense, a machine for producing the accidental ankle, not deliberately, not consciously, but inevitably, because the combination of the long skirt and the physical world produced, with regularity and variety, the situations that required the skirt to be raised. And every such situation was another moment of the ankle's brief, justified, deniable appearance. There is one more thing I want to explore before we move on from the street and into the other worlds where the ankle appeared, and that is the stocking. The stocking was what lay between the boot and the hem. The stocking was, in the Victorian context, the final layer of concealment, the last thing that stood between the visible world and the skin. And the stocking, like everything else in this story, was more complicated than it appeared. Victorian women's stockings were, for most of the century, white cotton in the standard case, white silk for the wealthy for special occasions. The white stocking was a practical choice. Cotton and silk were both easy to wash and bleach to whiteness, but it was also an aesthetic one. The white stocking, in the context of the white skin beneath it and the dark leather of the boot above and below it, created a particular visual effect. When the ankle was visible, when the boot ended and the hem had not yet begun, what was visible was this line of white, this narrow band of pale fabric against the dark boot leather, against the shadow under the skirt's hem. White was striking. In the half-light under a heavy skirt, in the autumn grey of an October street, the thin line of white cotton stocking was more visible than a darker colour would have been. It caught what light there was. It drew the eye to the precise location where the ankle was, even when the ankle was mostly covered. It was, functionally, a marker, the single bright element in an otherwise dark lower tableau. The white stocking was not chosen for this reason. The white stocking was chosen because it was conventional, because it was clean, because it was appropriate. But the effect it produced, that brief, bright flash of white between boot and hem, was part of the visual vocabulary of the Victorian ankle, and it contributed in its small way to the overall charge of the thing. Later in the century, coloured stockings became fashionable in certain circles. Black stockings in particular appeared in the 1880s and 1890s as an alternative to white. The black stocking was different in character. Against a dark boot and a dark skirt, it was less visible, which might have seemed to diminish the significance of the ankle, but actually seemed to produce the opposite effect. The black stocking read as deliberate, intentional, the choice of a woman who was aware of the ankle as a visible element and had made a considered decision about its presentation. The black stocking was, in the context of the 1880s, somewhat bold. It appeared in fashion plates with an increasing frequency across the decade. It was associated with a particular kind of fashionable modernity. The woman who wore black stockings was implicitly a woman who had thought about her ankles, which was itself a slightly charged thing to have thought about. The stocking, in other words, was not neutral. Nothing in the immediate vicinity of the Victorian ankle was neutral. Everything in that small zone of the visible and the just barely visible carried weight, because everything in that zone was part of the same charged system, the system of concealment and glimpse, of hiding and briefly showing, of the wall and the crack in the wall, the boot, the stocking, the hem, 3 layers of concealment operating in sequence, each one contributing its portion to the project of keeping the ankle out of the visible world, and each one, in the moment of the ankle's accidental appearance, contributing to the texture of what was seen, the gleam of the boot leather, the narrow band of pale stocking, the bottom edge of the heavy skirt, a tiny complete world, visible for 2 seconds and then gone. This was the Victorian ankle in its full context. Let us take it now into other places, away from the street, into the interior world of Victorian culture, the novels, the poems, the paintings, the ballrooms, the ice ponds, the theatres. Let us see what the ankle did there. The Victorian novel is one of the great documents of the Victorian era, which is not a surprising thing to say, since the novel was the dominant literary form of the 19th century, consumed by the middle classes with an appetite that was as close to insatiable as anything in publishing history. The circulating library, which allowed subscribers to borrow novels for a fee rather than paying the full purchase price, made the novel available to almost every household with any pretension to literacy. And the novel, returned from the circulating library in its cloth binding and read aloud in the evenings to the assembled family, was a social experience as much as a literary one, a shared encounter with story that bound people together and gave them a common imaginative world. The Victorian novel was also inevitably about manners, about the codes and protocols of social life, about what was done and what was not done, what was said and what was unsaid, what was seen and what was not seen. The Victorian novelist worked within the same system of concealment and implication that governed the rest of Victorian social life, and they deployed it with considerable skill. You could not say certain things in a Victorian novel published by a respectable house. You could not describe physical appearances with the directness that a later century would take for granted. You could not make explicit what the social code required, but you could do everything else. And in this space of implication, of the oblique glance and the loaded description, and the strategically placed detail, the ankle was one of the most productive available elements. The ankle appeared in the Victorian novel with a frequency and a consistency that, read now with awareness of what it meant at the time, is quite striking. It appeared not as the subject of the narrative, never as the subject of the narrative, but as a detail, a descriptive detail, carefully placed, carefully weighted, doing exactly the work it needed to do without drawing explicit attention to the fact that it was doing it. The great Victorian novelists understood this. Dickens, Thackeray, Hardy, Trollope, Gissing. All of them used the ankle as a narrative tool, sometimes gently and sometimes with more deliberate purpose. Thomas Hardy is probably the most acute observer of the female ankle in Victorian fiction. Hardy's Wessex novels are full of landscape and season and the physical world, and into this physical world Hardy places his female characters with a particularity of observation that is sometimes quietly startling. In Far from the Madding Crowd, published in 1874, Bathsheba Everdeen is first seen by Gabriel Oak when she arrives on a cart in the early morning. Hardy describes her sitting on a pile of household goods, her position slightly elevated above the road level, and then, after several paragraphs of other observation, he mentions, with a precision that can only be deliberate, the lower edge of her dress and the position of her feet. The detail is placed and then moved past quickly, as though it is merely part of the landscape. But it is not merely part of the landscape, it is a piece of characterization. Bathsheba is the kind of woman whose ankle you notice. This is information. In Tess of the D'Urbervilles, published in 1891, the ankles appear again, this time with more weight. When Tess walks across the fields in the early scenes, Hardy describes her movement with a physical precision that was almost unprecedentedly direct for a novel published in that decade, and the lower part of the leg, wet from the morning grass, visible as she moves through the long meadow plants, is part of this description. The Victorians who read it in serial form were aware that Hardy was doing something slightly unusual, slightly more direct than the standard novelistic treatment of the female body. Some critics objected. Hardy was, in this as in other things, pushing at the boundary of what the Victorian novel could say. Anthony Trollope is more conventional in his use of the ankle, and therefore, paradoxically, more instructive. Because Trollope does not push at boundaries, Trollope works squarely within the conventions of the social novel, which means that the ankle appears in his work in exactly the way the ankle was supposed to appear, as a detail that a perceptive observer notices and that tells him something about the woman concerned, but that is never commented upon directly, never made the explicit focus of a scene. In the Barchester novels and in the Palliser series, the ankle appears in descriptions of female movement, the particular way a woman navigates a room, mounts a staircase, enters a drawing room, and it is always part of a larger physical portrait that stops well short of anything explicit, but that tells you with complete precision whether the novelist wants you to find this character attractive or not. If Trollope mentions the ankle, or the lower portion of the dress, or the manner in which a woman moves through space, you're expected to form certain impressions. These impressions are never confirmed explicitly. They are simply there, available to the reader who knows how to read them, invisible to the reader who does not. This is Victorian novelistic technique at its most refined. The information is present but deniable, visible but not pointed at. George Eliot, Marianne Evans, writing under a male name because female authorship was still at a disadvantage in the literary marketplace, was a more complex case. Eliot is deeply interested in the physical as a manifestation of character, and the way women inhabit and move their bodies is always significant in her novels. In Middlemarch, published in 1871, the physical descriptions of Dorothea Brooke and Rosamund Vincy are part of the character analysis, and the lower body, the dress, the movement, the physical presence, is never quite absent from the picture. Eliot is more interested in psychology than in surfaces, but she understands that surfaces are psychology in the Victorian world, and she handles them accordingly. What all of these novelists share, Hardy, Trollope, Eliot, and dozens of others of the period, is an awareness of the ankle as a culturally loaded detail, and a skill in using that loading without triggering it. The ankle in the Victorian novel is like a key in a locked mechanism. Placed correctly, it opens things, the great Victorian novelist placed it correctly. If the novel was the domestic and social space for the ankle's literary appearance, Victorian poetry offered something more direct, or rather something that operated at a different kind of indirection, the indirection of the lyric rather than the narrative. Victorian poetry about women frequently engaged with the question of the female body through the safe harbour of classical or medieval reference. The pre-Raphaelite poets, Rossetti, Swinburne and Morris, developed an elaborate vocabulary of female physical description that was nominally about medieval heroines and classical goddesses, and was actually about the poets' very Victorian ideas of female beauty. The use of historical costume was essential to this project. You could describe a medieval lady's foot and ankle in a poem much more freely than you could describe a Victorian woman's, because the medieval setting removed the description from the realm of the immediately real and into the realm of the imaginatively available. Dante Gabriel Rossetti's paintings and poems are full of female figures whose physical presence is rendered with a particular kind of intensity, not explicit but loaded, every detail selected for maximum visual and emotional weight. The women in Rossetti's work are presented as aesthetic objects, and the rendering of their physical presence always includes the lower body, always includes the movement of their garments, always includes the feet, even if the feet are shown in sandals rather than Victorian boots. Swinburne, the most transgressive of the pre-Raphaelites in his verse, pushed considerably further. His poetry about classical female figures contains descriptions that his contemporaries found deeply unsettling, and several of his collections were withdrawn or censored. But even in Swinburne's most controlled work, the vocabulary of the female foot and ankle is present, not as something that required exposure, but as something that the classical or mythological setting made permissible, that the ornate sensory language of his verse made simultaneously present and veiled. In more conventional Victorian verse, the kind that appeared in gift books and family albums and the poetry sections of magazines, the ankle appears with less frequency and more circumspection. But it appears. The small lyric about watching a woman cross a garden, or descend a staircase, or move along a beach, was a minor but persistent Victorian genre, and the ankle was part of its vocabulary. Always positioned as an innocent and purely aesthetic observation, always the ankle admired as an element of graceful movement. These small poems were nonetheless part of the cultural conversation about what the ankle meant and what it was permissible to notice. One persistent Victorian poetic trope was the association of the ankle with grace, with a particular quality of movement that was considered the physical expression of femininity at its most refined. The word grace itself carried a moral weight in Victorian usage that it does not quite carry now. To be graceful was not simply to move elegantly, but to possess an inner quality that expressed itself in the elegance of movement, a kind of embodied virtue. The ankle, in this vocabulary, was not the ankle in isolation. It was the ankle as evidence of grace, and grace as evidence of character. The ankle that moved well was the ankle of a woman who was well. This is a consistent pattern in Victorian culture's engagement with the ankle. Whether in the novel, in the poem, in the social commentary, or in the private diary, the ankle is never just the ankle. It is always evidence of something, always a sign that points towards something else. The ankle stands for the body stands for the woman stands for all of the things that the Victorian world required women to stand for: grace, modesty, virtue, the complex and heavily freighted ideal of Victorian femininity that no individual woman could embody completely, and that no individual woman could escape. The ankle was the point of contact between that ideal and the physical world. It was where the ideal briefly, accidentally, became real. Let us move now to the ballroom. Let us move from the October street and the library and the reading chair, from the boots and the novels and the quiet afternoon, into an entirely different kind of space. A large room, brightly lit. Not gas now, but the full chandelier glare of a formal Victorian ballroom, dozens of lights reflected in the polished floor, in the long mirrors along the walls, in the jewellery and the silk of the asps. It is evening. It is a formal occasion, an assembly ball, perhaps, or a private dance at a prosperous townhouse, the kind of event that anchored the Victorian social calendar through the winter months. The women are in evening dress, which is different from day dress in ways that are immediately significant for our story. Evening dress showed more of the female body than day dress did. This was conventional, expected, entirely proper. It was the agreed and codified rule of Victorian social life that formal evening occasions allowed a different kind of presentation from the daytime street. The neckline of the evening bodice was lower, not dramatically low by our standards, but considerably lower than the high-necked day bodice, revealing the upper chest and the curve of the shoulder and sometimes the upper arm. The sleeves were often short or absent, but the skirt was still long. The skirt was always long for every occasion, in every period of the Victorian era. Whatever the evening neckline showed, the evening skirt concealed. The line held. The hem was always on the floor, and yet there was the dance. The waltz had been the dominant ballroom form since the early years of the century, and by the mid-Victorian era it was central to the social calendar. The waltz is a dance in which the couple moves continuously across the floor in a turning, sweeping motion, the woman's right hand in the man's left, his right arm at her waist, her left hand on his shoulder, their bodies close enough that the skirt of her dress pressed against his legs as they turned. The waltz produced movement, significant, continuous, sweeping movement, and movement in a floor-length skirt produced exactly the kind of hem management challenges we have already discussed, with one crucial difference. In the ballroom, the movement was sustained. It was not the brief raising of the skirt to negotiate a puddle. It was 3 minutes of continuous rotation, of continuous turning, of the heavy skirt moving with the woman's body through its arc, and in that movement, the hem did not always stay on the floor. When the waltz reached its full speed, when the couple was well into the dance turning quickly, the centrifugal force of the turn pulling at the skirt, the outer edge of the hem would lift, fractionally, an inch, perhaps 2, enough to show to anyone watching from the right position the very bottom of the boot, the toe, the instep, and occasionally in a fast turn the ankle itself briefly for a moment before the hem settled. This was known, this was understood. Everyone in the ballroom, the dancers, the chaperones sitting along the walls, the men standing at the edge of the floor watching, everyone understood that the waltz produced this possibility, and everyone had mutually agreed to regard it as part of the dance. The waltz was fast enough, physically demanding enough, that the occasional hemline movement was categorized as an unavoidable consequence of the activity, not a deliberate immodesty. But everyone still looked. This was the particular genius of the Victorian ballroom as a social space. It was a place where looking was licensed, where attention was paid to the moving body in a way that was completely appropriate, because looking at dancers is what you do at a dance. Everyone was watching the dance, and the dance included the hem, and the hem occasionally included the ankle, and the ankle was there to be seen, and the seeing was legitimate. Young men went to balls and watched women dance. This is documented. This was expected. The Victorian ball was a marriage market formally, and assessment of a potential partner required looking at the face, the figure, the expression, the quality of movement, looking at, among other things, the hem, looking at, on the fortunate turns of the waltz, the ankle. A Victorian man writing in his private diary about a ball he had attended might note, in the careful, sideways, slightly coded language that private Victorian male writing used for such observations, that a particular young woman had danced with particular grace, that her movement had been especially elegant. These observations, rendered in the vocabulary of aesthetic appreciation, meant specific things. They are notes taken on the visible physical person of the woman, stored against a future that might or might not include a more formal acquaintance. The ankle was part of these notes, not always explicitly noted. Sometimes the whole passage of observation was encoded in the word grace, which covered everything, but present in the observation, present in the watching, present in the charged attention of the Victorian ballroom at the moment when the waltz turned fast and the hem lifted its inch. Ice skating. We need to talk about ice skating, because ice skating is the single most productive location in the entire Victorian social landscape for the appearance of the ankle, and the one that the Victorians themselves seemed most consistently delighted by, and the one that produced, in the diaries and the social commentary and the illustrated press, the most consistent evidence of the ankle's cultural charge. The winter of the mid-Victorian era brought, in cold years, frozen ponds and lakes in the parks and on the commons, the Serpentine in Hyde Park, the Long Water in Kensington Gardens, the pond on Hampstead Heath. These froze in the harder winters, and when they froze they became, within hours, one of the most popular social spaces in London. The Victorians were passionate skaters. Skating was fashionable, energetic, social, and it had the advantage, from the point of view of middle-class respectability, of being completely acceptable. It was outdoor exercise, it was sociable, it was mixed company in a setting where mixed company was entirely correct, and it produced ankles, with more consistency and more variety than almost any other single social activity in the Victorian calendar. Here is why. Ice skating requires lateral ankle movement in a way that walking does not. The skater pushes sideways with each stroke, transferring weight from one blade to the other, and this lateral push requires the ankle to flex and rotate in a way that the forward stride of walking does not. More importantly, the balance required for skating, the constant small adjustments to maintain equilibrium on a narrow blade on a slippery surface, is achieved largely through the ankle. The ankle is the primary balancing joint in skating. It is constantly active, constantly adjusting, constantly doing visible work, and because the ice surface is flat and the skating posture involves a forward lean, the skirt rises more readily than in ordinary walking. A woman skating energetically across the frozen Serpentine was, from the perspective of the surrounding onlookers, showing considerably more of her lower limbs than she would on any other social occasion. This was documented by the illustrated press with enormous enthusiasm. Punch, the Illustrated London News, and the various illustrated magazines of the period ran images of skating scenes throughout the winters of the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s. These images, careful woodcut engravings, technically demanding to produce, consistently showed, among other things, ankles, not as the stated subject of the illustration. The stated subject was skating, was winter recreation, was the fashionable crowd at the park. But the ankles were there, carefully rendered, clearly visible in the images of women in mid-stroke, their skirts lifted by the motion, their boots and the lower portion of their stockings visible. The illustrators chose these moments. Of all the possible moments in a skating scene, of all the possible positions and compositions available, they chose, consistently, repeatedly, across decades of illustration, the moments that showed the ankle. This was not accidental. The illustrators knew their market. The experience of skating also produced, with a naturalness and a necessity that the Victorian social code found difficult to argue with, the circumstance of the fall. And when a woman fell on the ice, which happened, and was expected to happen, because ice is slippery and skating is difficult, the act of falling produced a far greater degree of ankle visibility than the most vigorous waltz ever achieved. A woman falling on ice landed in a manner that the skirt could not quite manage. The legs went forward, or sideways, or at some angle that was simply not compatible with the preservation of the hem's floor-length modesty. The result was, for a moment, a degree of lower limb visibility that had no equivalent in any other legitimate Victorian social context. And the people around had all, by the unanimous and very convenient convention of the skating pond, agreed to regard falls as part of the activity, as nothing to remark upon. The fall was deniable. What it showed was not technically remarked upon, but it was seen. Victorian gentlemen helped ladies up from falls on the ice with a solicitude that went beyond what the circumstances strictly required. This is documented in enough accounts to be considered a reliable social observation. The helping up, which required physical contact, required the taking of hands, sometimes required the steadying arm at the waist, was the closest that the Victorian social code permitted a man and a woman who were not already intimate to come to physical proximity in a public setting. And it occurred in the direct aftermath of the fall which had produced the ankle. The frozen serpentine on a good skating afternoon in January was, consequently, a more charged social environment than almost anything else the Victorian calendar had to offer, and everybody knew it, and everybody went anyway, and the illustrated press covered it with enthusiasm, and the private diaries of the period record it with the careful, oblique pleasure of people enjoying something without quite saying what they are enjoying. Ice skating in the Victorian social imagination was a gift. Beyond the ballroom and the skating pond, the Victorian social calendar offered a range of outdoor activities that provided, with varying degrees of reliability, their own opportunities for the ankle's appearance. Let us consider a few of them. Croquet was fashionable in the 1860s and 1870s, with an enthusiasm that, to our eyes, might seem disproportionate to the game's actual excitement. It was played on the lawn of the country house, or the suburban villa, on a warm afternoon, with a mixed group of young people who were otherwise engaged in the very careful social management of proximity to each other that the Victorian middle class required. Croquet was, in a sense, a technology of supervised interaction, a game that gave young men and women an excuse to be on the same lawn at the same time, performing a physical activity together, with the sanction of the social setting and the presence of their elders in deck chairs at the perimeter. And the physical activity of croquet, the bending, the aiming, the striking of the ball, the movement around the hoops, produced, with pleasing regularity, the management challenges that we have now come to recognize. The croquet stroke required a forward bend that brought the mallet to the level of the ball, which was on the ground. This bend, in a floor-length skirt, produced a particular kind of tension in the fabric at the hem. The front of the skirt was pulled tight, the back lifted, and the foot in its boot came into sharp visibility. This moment, the moment of the stroke, was the most photographically composed moment in croquet. It produced consistently, the view that Victorian illustrators found most appealing to render. There is a reason that the images of croquet that appear in the Victorian illustrated press so often choose the moment of the stroke rather than any other moment in the game. It is not because the stroke is visually interesting in itself. Croquet is not, by any standard, a visually thrilling sport. It is because the stroke produced the ankle, and the ankle, in the summer garden, in the afternoon light, against the green of the lawn and the colours of the summer dresses, was worth illustrating. The croquet lawn was consequently a productive space. Young men paid close attention to the play of their companions. Young women were, on the whole, well aware of this. The management of the skirt during the stroke, how much to gather it up, whether to let the front fall naturally or to hold it back slightly with the non-playing hand, was a matter that the more socially aware participants had thought about in advance. Now, the bicycle. This requires a somewhat longer discussion because the bicycle was not merely a social setting in which the ankle appeared. The bicycle was, in the 1880s and 1890s, a social crisis in which the ankle, and the entire question of what the female body was permitted to display in public, became the central battleground of a cultural argument that was about much more than transportation. The bicycle was introduced to a wide public in the 1880s through the development of the safety bicycle, the design with two equal-sized wheels and a chain drive that we would still recognize as a bicycle today, which replaced the dangerous and unwieldy penny farthing of the earlier decade. The safety bicycle was immediately and enormously popular. Men took to it enthusiastically, women took to it with equal enthusiasm, and this, women's enthusiasm for the bicycle, was where the cultural argument began. Because cycling in a floor-length skirt was, to put it mildly, difficult. The long skirt caught in the chain, the long skirt tangled in the pedals, the long skirt blew up in the wind of movement. The long skirt, in short, was fundamentally incompatible with the physical activity of cycling, in a way that the long skirt had managed to coexist, however uncomfortably, with walking and dancing and even skating. The women who wanted to cycle, and there were many of them, because the bicycle offered something that middle-class Victorian women had never had before. Personal, independent, unsupervised mobility faced a practical problem, and the practical solution was a change of dress. Either a much shortened skirt or the adoption of the bifurcated garment, the divided skirt or the knickerbockers, or what became known as bloomers. The response to this was extraordinary. Not the cycling itself, the cycling was fine at the level of polite social discourse. What was not fine, what produced a level of public agitation disproportionate to the actual stakes involved, was the garment that the cycling required. A woman in a shortened skirt on a bicycle was showing not just the ankle but the lower leg. A woman in knickerbockers on a bicycle was showing the outline of the leg itself. This was not the ankle. This was something different. Something that the long decades of the Victorian skirt had trained the public eye never to see. The cycling controversy was fierce. Newspapers ran letters, magazines ran opinion pieces, clergymen preached sermons, doctors published opinions, some supporting cycling as healthy exercise for women, some warning against it on grounds that were usually medical in their framing but distinctly moral in their implications. The argument was ostensibly about the appropriate dress for female cyclists. It was actually about the appropriate amount of the female body to be visible in public. It was about the wall. The women who cycled in shortened skirts or knickerbockers were not simply making a practical clothing choice. They were making a statement about the wall. They were saying, with their bodies and their clothing and their movement through public space, that the wall was negotiable, that the rules of concealment were not absolute, that the female body could be visible to a greater degree than the long Victorian tradition had permitted, without catastrophe. The catastrophe that their opponents predicted was not, of course, a physical one. It was a social and moral one, the catastrophe of the end of the particular form of female modesty that the Victorian era had constructed and enforced. If the ankle could be shown on the bicycle, what else could be shown? If the lower leg was permissible in motion, what about at rest? If the knickerbockers on the cycling path were acceptable, what about on the street? The logic of concealment, once breached at any point, seemed to threaten the entire structure. This anxiety was not irrational from within the Victorian value system. The wall of concealment was indeed a system, a connected set of practices and standards and mutual agreements, and the bicycle was indeed eventually the beginning of its unravelling, not immediately, not in a single decade, but the women who cycled in knickerbockers in 1895 were part of a cultural shift that would, within 20 years, produce the walking dress with the ankle-length hem, and within 30 years, the above-the-knee skirt that would have caused a Victorian drawing room to faint collectively. The bicycle was the beginning of the end of the Victorian ankle's special significance. It was the first major public challenge to the system of concealment that had made the ankle what it was. It did not finish that system immediately, but it opened the argument, and arguments once opened do not always close in the direction of the people who opened them. Let us go to the theatre. Specifically, let us go to the music hall, the particular Victorian entertainment form that occupied the middle ground between the respectable theatre and the disreputable penny gaff, the entertainment that was attended by the middle classes on evenings when they wanted to be slightly less respectable than usual, and that provided in its own way a very different relationship with the female ankle from anything we've discussed so far. The music hall was a venue, a large one usually, a purpose-built auditorium with a stage, a pit, a gallery, sometimes a promenade area at the back where customers could walk and drink and socialise while the performance continued. The performances were variety, a succession of acts, each one different, singers and comedians and acrobats and conjurers and specialty performers of various kinds, all arranged in a programme that lasted the whole evening and required sustained audience attention to nothing for very long. Among the performers in the music hall programme were the dancers, and the dancers in the music hall were a very different proposition from the dancers in the Victorian ballroom. The music hall dancer, the chorus girl, the can-can performer, the specialty dance in the variety programme, was not subject to the same rules of concealment that governed the respectable middle-class world outside the theatre's walls. She was, in fact, in precisely the opposite relationship with those rules. The music hall dancer's job was to show the can-can, which arrived in London from Paris in the 1860s and became enormously popular in the music halls of the 1870s and 1880s, showed the leg to the thigh. This was not an accident. The can-can was specifically designed around the revelation of the leg, the high kick, the split, the movement that lifted the skirts to a height that would have been simply unimaginable in any other public context. The can-can dancer showed ankle, calf, knee, and thigh, repeatedly, enthusiastically, in a brightly lit venue before a large and paying audience. This was perfectly legal. This was, within the specific context of the music hall, perfectly acceptable. The music hall was a ring-fenced space where different rules applied, where the concealment that the street and the drawing room required was explicitly suspended in favour of entertainment. The audience understood this. The performers understood this. The authorities, who periodically attempted to regulate the content of music hall performances, understood this. But the music hall did something very interesting to the ankle in the Victorian cultural economy. It made the ankle, and much more than the ankle, available for viewing in one specific, licensed, commercially governed context. And this availability in the music hall threw the concealment everywhere else into even sharper relief. The same man who watched the can-can at the music hall on a Friday evening would, on Saturday afternoon, be standing on the pavement of a respectable street, watching women negotiate the curb, and the brief flash of ankle under the street dress would carry all the charge it always had, enhanced, perhaps, by the contrast with what he had seen the night before. The music hall did not reduce the significance of the ankle. It defined it more precisely, by showing what lay beyond it, and then putting that beyond firmly back behind the stage door. The ankle was the ankle because of what it was not, because of what lay above it that was invisible. The music hall provided a glimpse of that above, and then withdrew it, and then the respectable world resumed with the ankle, carrying all its usual meaning and some of the music hall's more emphatic contrast besides. The Victorians were very skilled at this kind of zoning. The separation of the world into spaces where different rules applied, the public street, the drawing room, the music hall, the club, allowed them to maintain the rules of each space with relative purity, because the transgressions of one space did not automatically contaminate the others. You could go to the music hall and watch the can-can, and then come home and be a perfectly respectable person, because the music hall was its own world with its own rules, and those rules did not follow you home. The ankle benefited from this zoning. It remained, in the respectable world, exactly what it was, charged, hidden, occasionally visible, carefully managed, because the respectable world was a specific and bounded space with specific and bounded rules, and those rules were maintained by the collective effort of everyone inside the space, including the people who went to the music hall on Friday evenings and knew perfectly well what they would see there: the conduct books. I want to spend a moment on the conduct books, because they are important, and because they are funny, or rather, they are funny to us now, and were very serious to the people who read them, and the gap between what was funny and what was serious is itself instructive. The Victorian era produced an extraordinary quantity of advice literature directed at women, books of etiquette and manners, guides to conduct and deportment, handbooks for the new wife, the young lady entering society, the governess, the housekeeper, the daughter of the house. These books, sold in large numbers, were reviewed in the magazines, were given as gifts, were kept on the shelves of middle-class households alongside the Bible and the cookery books. They were part of the infrastructure of Victorian respectability, the codification in print of the things that everyone was supposed to know and that apparently needed to be stated explicitly in order for everyone to know them. The conduct books had opinions about the ankle, not stated as opinions about the ankle, because the ankle could not be mentioned directly in a conduct book. The very act of mentioning the ankle explicitly would have been evidence of the kind of impropriety that the conduct book existed to prevent. The ankle appeared in the conduct books obliquely, as the conduct book's subject matter always appeared, under the heading of deportment or dress or the management of the skirt in public. On the subject of walking, the conduct books were thorough. A lady walks with measured steps. A lady does not stride. A lady does not swing her arms. A lady does not look at her feet. A lady does not allow her dress to drag on the ground, but neither does she lift it higher than absolutely necessary to prevent dragging. This last instruction, neither dragging nor lifted higher than absolutely necessary, is the conduct book's coded engagement with the ankle question. It is acknowledging with very careful precision that there is a correct height for the hem in relation to the ground, and that this correct height is the lowest height compatible with preventing soiling. Any higher is unnecessary. An unnecessary elevation of the hem is exactly what a lady does not do. The conduct books also address the question of stairs. The management of the skirt on the staircase was a practical and social challenge, and the conduct books were specific about it. When ascending a staircase in company, a lady gathers her skirt at one side with one hand, raising it sufficiently to prevent stepping on it, but no more. On descending, the same. The instruction is practical, but the word sufficiently is doing a great deal of work. Sufficiently means what is necessary. What is necessary is determined by the staircase. What is shown, the ankle, possibly more, is the consequence of necessity and not of choice. The conduct book is describing with great precision the mechanics of the legitimate ankle. The sections on dancing were similarly careful. The conduct book approved of dancing. It was healthful exercise. It was a correct social activity. It brought young people together under proper supervision. The conduct book approved of the waltz, but the conduct book noted that a lady in the waltz should hold herself correctly, should maintain the proper distance from her partner, should manage the skirt with the particular care that the vigour of the dance required. What the conduct book meant, without saying, was that the waltz showed the ankle, and this was acceptable, but that it should show only the ankle and nothing beyond it, and that the management of the skirt was the mechanism by which this boundary was maintained. The conduct books were, in other words, managing the ankle. They were regulating it. They were establishing with considerable precision the terms under which it was permissible and the terms under which it was not. They were the formal codification of the social agreement that the ankle operated under, the set of rules that made the ankle what it was, that gave it its specific meaning, that distinguished it from the merely visible and located it firmly in the realm of the charged. This is the genius, if one can call it that, of the Victorian system. The conduct book, by addressing the ankle as a site of management and regulation, was simultaneously producing the ankle as a site of significance. You cannot regulate something that does not matter. The very fact that the conduct book spent so much careful effort on the appropriate height of the hem was evidence that the hem mattered, that what was above and below it was not neutral. The regulation created the significance as surely as the concealment created the charge, class and the ankle. We have been speaking for most of tonight of the middle-class Victorian woman, the woman of the respectable household, the circulating library, the assembly ball, the croquet lawn, the skating pond. This is where most of our evidence comes from, because the middle classes were the class that produced most of the written and illustrated record of Victorian social life, and because they were the class for whom respectability was the central cultural concern. But the Victorian ankle was a class phenomenon as well as a gender one, and the relationship between class and the ankle is worth exploring, because it was complicated. Working class women wore shorter skirts, not dramatically shorter, not mid-calf, not knee-length, but the hem of a working class woman's everyday dress sat a few inches above the ground rather than on it, for the excellent practical reason that the working class woman was on her feet all day, doing work that a floor-length skirt would make impossible. The factory worker, the laundress, the market trader, the domestic servant at her heavy cleaning, all of these women wore garments adapted to the requirements of physical labour, and that adaptation included the raised hem. The working class woman's ankle was consequently visible in ordinary daily life in a way that the middle class woman's was not. The ankle was simply there, present, functional, unremarked. It was not hidden, and therefore it was not charged, at least not in the specific way that middle-class concealment charged the middle-class ankle. This distinction was noted, and it was noted in ways that reveal the class structure of the ankle's significance. The middle-class man's attention to the middle-class ankle was a specific response to middle-class concealment. The same man looking at a working-class woman on the street whose ankles were simply visible as part of her ordinary appearance was looking at something differently constituted. The working-class ankle was not the charged object that the middle-class ankle was, not because it was intrinsically different, but because the system of concealment that created the charge was a specifically middle-class system. This was recognized, implicitly if not explicitly, in the literature of the period. The Victorian social novel, when it depicted working-class female characters, did not apply to them the same ankle logic that it applied to its middle-class heroines. The ankle of the middle-class heroine was a significant detail. The ankle of the working-class woman was simply part of her physical appearance, not particularly notable. The aristocratic woman occupied a different position again. The aristocracy, at the very top of the social hierarchy, operated under rules that were simultaneously stricter in some respects than middle-class respectability, and more relaxed in others. The great country house, the London season, the hunting field and the shooting party. The aristocratic social world was more physically active, more outdoor, more willing to accept the practical consequences of physical activity than the careful middle-class drawing room. An aristocratic woman on horseback in the hunting field was wearing a habit that showed her lower limbs to an extent that would have been scandalous in a middle-class parlour. This was accepted because the hunting field had its own rules, and those rules were part of a different and in some ways less anxious relationship with the body. But the aristocratic woman in London, in the season, in the drawing rooms and ballrooms and parks of the social world, was as carefully managed as any middle-class woman. The aristocracy, at the level of the social performance, was in many ways more rigidly correct than the middle classes, because the middle classes were anxious to be thought respectable, which required constant effort, while the aristocracy was simply respectable by definition, which made the performance of respectability a matter of form rather than anxiety. The ankle, consequently, cut across class in ways that were specific and interesting. It meant most, carried most charge, produced the most significant cultural effect in the world of the middle classes, the world of striving and performance and anxious maintenance of standards. It was most absent, most simply functional in the world of hard physical labour, and it was most formal, most correctly managed in the world of the aristocracy. This is not surprising when you understand that the ankle was always a sign of the social system that surrounded it, not a thing in itself. The ankle was wherever the social system was. And the social system that the Victorian middle classes had constructed, with its elaborate machinery of concealment and respectability, and the careful management of what was shown and what was hidden, was the social system in which the ankle flourished most fully as a charged and significant object. Let us look now at what men actually wrote, not what they published, not what they said in public, or what appeared in their novels, or what they claimed in conversations, or what they argued in the magazines. What they wrote in private, in diaries, in letters, in the notebooks and journals that were not intended for public view. What they wrote when there was no audience, when the codes of public discourse did not apply, when they could say what they actually thought. The private diary is one of the great historical documents. The Victorians kept them in large numbers, and enough of them have survived in archives and libraries and family collections, eventually published or at least transcribed, to give us a reasonably substantial view of what Victorian men wrote in private about the things they observed and experienced. And the ankle appears in these diaries with a consistency and a precision that is striking even now if you know what to look for. Let us be clear about what kind of writing we are discussing. Not pornographic writing, not the underground literature of the period, which existed and which dealt with the ankles and everything above them in terms that were very direct, but that represented a very specific and deliberately transgressive genre. We are talking about ordinary diaries, respectable diaries, the kind kept by professional men, clergymen, doctors, lawyers, merchants, academics. The solid middle-class Victorian man who was also a writer of private journals, who recorded his days and his thoughts and his observations with a regularity and a care. In these diaries the ankle appears, not constantly, not as a dominant theme, but with enough frequency and enough specific detail to make clear that it was something that the writers noticed, that they chose to record, and that they felt the recording of warranted a private space rather than a public one. The writing is characteristically oblique. Victorian private writing about the ankles of women is not less circumspect than Victorian public writing about the same subject. It is sometimes more so, because the private diarist was often his own strictest censor, recording things at the furthest remove of indirection that allowed him to preserve the observation without quite having to acknowledge directly what the observation was about. A typical diary entry of this kind might read, "Attended the Harrogate Assembly with H and Mrs. H. The dancing was well conducted. Miss E performed the waltz with particular grace." That is everything explicitly said. Miss E has performed the waltz with particular grace, but we know from the context and from the conventions of the writing what has been observed and why it has been recorded. Miss E has performed the waltz in such a way that the ankle was visible, and the visibility of the ankle has produced an impression that is worth noting, and the noting is done in the vocabulary of aesthetic appreciation, because that is the only vocabulary available in the private diary as in the public world for this particular observation. Other diarists were slightly less decorous. Arthur Munby, a Victorian barrister and amateur poet, who kept an extraordinarily detailed diary for most of his adult life, was one of the most systematic observers of working-class women's bodies in the Victorian period, a fascination that he pursued with a thoroughness that his contemporaries would have found alarming and that later scholars have found deeply interesting. Munby's diaries record, with a specificity and a frequency that goes well beyond the norm, observations of female legs and feet and ankles in public settings, at railway stations, in the street, at markets. Munby was, in some respects, at the extreme end of Victorian male ankle observation, but he was operating within a system that his contemporaries shared. The difference was quantitative rather than qualitative. He noticed more, and he wrote more of what he noticed, but he noticed the same things that other men noticed, and wrote less of. The private letters of Victorian men sometimes carried observations of the same kind, in a slightly more social register. A man writing to a close male friend about a social event might permit himself, in the privacy of the letter, which was after all only going to one person, a slightly less decorous observation than the diary allowed. The letter form permitted a kind of masculine confidence, a sharing of observation between friends that the diary's strict self-censorship sometimes prevented. Here too the ankle appeared, obliquely in the vocabulary of aesthetic appreciation, but recognizably and specifically as something observed and worth mentioning. What do these private writings tell us? They tell us that the Victorian ankle was not merely a theoretical cultural phenomenon, not merely something that appeared in novels and conduct books and social commentary as an abstraction. It was a lived experience. It was something that specific men, in specific moments, on specific afternoons, in specific streets or ballrooms or skating ponds, actually saw and actually responded to and actually chose to record. The charge was real. The response was real. The significance of the ankle was not a fiction of the social code. It was a genuine psychological response produced by the social code, but experienced as real by the people who lived within it. The system of concealment had done its work. The long decades of the floor-length skirt, the formal architecture of respectability, the careful management of what was shown and what was hidden, all of this had produced, in the men who lived inside it, a genuine orientation of attention toward the ankle and what it represented. They were not pretending to find it significant. They were not performing a social role in their private diaries where no audience existed. They found it significant because the world they lived in had made it significant, had trained their attention toward it, had charged it with the weight of everything the skirt concealed. The ankle was significant because the wall was real. Now let us look at the paintings. Victorian painting is an enormous subject. The Victorian Royal Academy exhibitions were vast annual events. The walls of the Great Gallery space hung floor to ceiling with canvases in every style and subject, from history painting to portraiture to landscape to the elaborate narrative scenes that the Victorian public loved best. And across this enormous production of visual art, the ankle appears. It appears most directly in the paintings of everyday life, the genre scenes that depicted ordinary Victorian existence with a specificity and a richness of detail that makes them invaluable historical documents as well as works of art. These paintings, William Powell Frith's railway station, and seaside and racecourse crowd scenes, George Elgar Hicks's depictions of women in domestic and social settings, Luke Fildes' carefully observed interiors, placed women in the middle of Victorian daily life and depicted them with the same attention to dress and appearance that the Victorian public brought to the actual women in their actual lives. In these paintings, the hem is always there. The skirt is always floor length. The boot is always the narrow, buttoned, gleaming object that we have already described. And occasionally, in the right kind of scene, at the right kind of moment, the ankle appears. The woman climbing the stairs, the woman stepping into a carriage, the woman in the garden bending to pick up something from the ground, the woman at the seaside with the wind off the sea pressing the skirt against her legs and lifting the hem from behind. These moments are chosen. The Victorian painter, like the Victorian illustrator, knew what he was doing when he composed his scene around the moment that produced the ankle. The Royal Academy was not the music hall. It was the most respectable public exhibition in England, the annual display of the nation's artistic production, attended by the Queen and reviewed in every newspaper. It could not be scandalous. It could not depict anything explicitly improper. But it could depict women at the moment of the ankle's legitimate appearance, and it did so with a regularity that, read now with awareness of the context, is quite apparent. The pre-Raphaelite painters deserve a separate note here, because they were doing something slightly different from the mainstream of Victorian painting. The pre-Raphaelites, Millais, Hunt, Rossetti, Burne-Jones, were interested in a particular kind of physical presence, a particular intensity of sensory detail that mainstream Victorian painting often avoided. Their women are rendered with an attention to physical texture, the weight of fabric, the the curve of form beneath it, the relationship between body and garment, that produces a different effect from the more decorously managed depictions of the mainstream. In Millet's Ophelia, the floating figure of the dead woman, her dress spread around her in the water, her hands just visible above the surface. This is not a painting about the ankle, but it is a painting about the body and its relationship to its concealing fabric, about what is shown and what is hidden, about the edge between the covered and the uncovered. The pre-Raphaelites were interested in edges, and the ankle was the most significant edge in Victorian visual culture. John William Waterhouse, working in the later pre-Raphaelite tradition, produced a series of paintings of classical and mythological female figures whose physical presence is rendered with the same kind of sensory intensity that Rossetti brought to his earlier work. Waterhouse's figures often have visible lower limbs, sandals, bare feet, the lower leg visible below a gathered or lifted garment, because the classical setting permitted this, because the Victorian gallery-going public accepted it as art rather than immodesty. The classical female body was a legitimate subject. The Victorian female body, shown to the same degree, would not have been. Victorian painting, in other words, used the same strategy as Victorian poetry. The classical or medieval reference as a license for physical description that the contemporary subject did not permit, and in doing so, it kept in circulation, in the public visual culture, a vocabulary of the female lower body that the street and the drawing room kept carefully suppressed. The rational dress movement. In 1881, a group of women in London founded an organisation called the Rational Dress Society. Their aim was, as the name suggests, to argue for a more rational approach to women's dress, by which they meant, primarily, dress that did not damage the health, did not impede movement, and did not require the wearing of multiple heavy garments in the name of modesty. The rational dress reformers had several targets. The corset was the primary one, the long, rigid, boned undergarment that compressed the torso and displaced the internal organs in ways that doctors and reformers had been documenting with increasing alarm since at least the 1860s. The multiple petticoat was another. The sheer weight of fabric carried by a fully dressed middle-class Victorian woman was, by any practical standard, excessive. The floor-length skirt was a third. The reformers argued for reform of the skirt with the specific argument that the floor-length skirt was unhygienic. This was not simply a rhetorical point. The Victorian street was genuinely dirty. Horse-borne traffic produced an almost unimaginable quantity of organic material on the road surface, and the long skirt that swept the pavement collected this material with perfect efficiency. A Victorian woman's hem at the end of a day's walking in London was not clean. This was known. This was generally acknowledged. The floor-length skirt as a hygiene practice was genuinely problematic. The rational dress reformers argued that the skirt should be shortened, not dramatically, not to the knee, not to any length that would have seemed immodest by the standards of the era, simply shortened enough to clear the ground, shortened to ankle length at the least. The ankle-length skirt, which would show the ankle and the boot as a matter of course rather than as an occasional accidental revelation, was the rational dress reformers' proposed alternative to the floor-length garment that both concealed the ankle and collected the street. The response to this proposal was remarkable. The response was not calm. The response was not a measured consideration of the hygiene argument. The response was, in significant measure, alarm. The kind of alarm that suggested the proposal had touched something much more fundamental than a practical question about skirt length. And of course it had. The proposal to shorten the skirt to ankle length was not, at the practical level, a very radical proposal, an inch off the hem, maybe 2, the ankle visible as a matter of course, the boot showing clearly. This was what was being proposed, and the resistance to it was ferocious, persistent, moral in its register, and indicative of exactly how deeply the floor-length skirt was embedded in the Victorian system of respectability. Because the floor-length skirt was not just a skirt, the floor-length skirt was the wall. To propose shortening it was to propose modifying the wall, to reduce its height, to allow the ankle to be permanently visible rather than occasionally and accidentally so. This would change the ankle's meaning entirely. If the ankle was always visible, it ceased to be the charged object it was. If there was no wall, there was no crack in the wall, and the crack in the wall was the whole mechanism. The rational dress reformers were therefore proposing not just a change in dress, but a change in the entire system of meanings that the dress produced. Whether or not they fully understood this, and some of them did, the more politically conscious ones who were simultaneously involved in the suffrage movement and the movement for women's education, they were doing something that the defenders of the floor-length skirt rightly identified as significant. The floor-length skirt survived the 1880s, it survived the 1890s. The rational dress reform was not, in the short term, successful. The skirt length did not change significantly until the second decade of the 20th century. But the argument had been made, and the argument was now on the table, and arguments that are on the table do not simply disappear when they fail to win immediately. The rational dress reformers had articulated with clarity the connection between the long skirt and the particular kind of female modesty that Victorian culture enforced. They had pointed at the wall and said, "This is a wall, and it is made of fabric, and it is not inevitable, and it could be otherwise." The Victorians who opposed them heard this clearly, and their opposition was fierce precisely because it was clear. The Victorian seaside. There is one final setting that we need to visit before we turn to the closing chapters of this story, and that is the seaside. Because the Victorian seaside is in some ways the most interesting of all the sites where the ankle appeared, the most complicated, the most contradictory, the most revealing of the tensions at the heart of the Victorian relationship with the visible body. The seaside was fashionable. The Victorian middle classes went to the seaside in large numbers, particularly after the railway made it accessible from the great cities of the Midlands and the North. Brighton, Eastbourne, Scarborough, Lytham, Southport. The seaside resorts of Victorian England were prosperous, busy, socially complex places, full of the middle classes at leisure, negotiating the particular challenges that leisure posed to the machinery of respectability. One of those challenges was the sea itself. The Victorian cult of sea bathing was almost universal. Everyone bathed. Everyone was supposed to benefit from the healthy effects of cold seawater on the constitution. The doctors recommended it. The guidebooks promoted it. The resorts provided facilities for it. Bathing machines on the beach. Those curious wooden huts on wheels that were drawn by horses into the water so that the bather could descend directly from the machine into the sea without being visible from the shore. The bathing machine was an extraordinary invention. It was at its most basic a changing room on wheels. You entered it on the beach, in your ordinary clothes. You changed into your bathing costume inside. The horse drew the machine into the water. You descended the steps at the sea-facing end, which was crucially the end facing away from the shore, and entered the water. When you were done, you climbed back in. The machine was drawn back to shore. You changed back into your clothes, and you exited onto the beach in your respectable morning dress. The entire process was designed to ensure that the bather was never visible in their bathing costume from the shore. The bathing machine was a mobile screen, a technology of concealment adapted to the specific challenge of immersing the body in the sea without revealing it to public view. And yet, and here is where the seaside becomes interesting, the bathing costume itself was quite revealing by the standards of the era. The women's bathing costume of the mid-Victorian period was a dark flannel dress that reached to roughly the knee. The knee, not the ankle, the knee. The same women who maintained the floor-length hem on the promenade, who negotiated puddles and curbs with careful hemline management, who required a bathing machine to change their clothes, wore in the water a garment that showed the calf, the knee, and sometimes more, depending on the buoyancy of wet flannel. The bathing machine was the justification. The bathing machine made the bathing costume acceptable, in exactly the way that the puddle made the raised hem acceptable. The bathing machine was the external necessity, the technical apparatus that explained why the lower limbs were visible, that removed the visibility from the category of choice, and placed it in the category of unavoidable consequence. The woman in her bathing costume in the sea was not choosing to show her lower limbs, she was bathing. The showing was necessary for the bathing. The bathing was healthy. The health was the reason. The reason made everything acceptable, except, of course, for the mixed bathing question. The Victorian seaside was, for most of the century, strictly segregated by sex for bathing. Men bathed in one designated area, women in another, and the areas were separated by a sufficient distance to prevent the view from one to the other. This segregation was enforced, not always effectively, by the bathing machine operators and the local authorities. The segregation was the machine of concealment adapted to the beach, the wall erected in the open air, between the sexes, using geography rather than fabric. And the boundary was not always perfectly maintained. The separation was not always sufficient. The beach at a crowded resort was a public space, with the ordinary public space's capacity for accidental visual encounters. People who were supposed to be separated by geography sometimes encountered each other. The bathing costume was seen sometimes by people who were not supposed to see it, and the bathing costume showed the lower leg. The Victorian seaside was, consequently, a place of considerable social complexity, a place where the rules of the street and the drawing room were simultaneously maintained in one register and thoroughly disrupted in another, where the machinery of concealment was working harder than anywhere else, and also failing in more spectacular ways, where the ankle's special significance was both preserved and undermined by the same set of circumstances. The beach photographic studios that appeared in the seaside resorts from the 1860s onward produced, as one of their standard products, photographs of women in bathing costume, not in the water, not in the sea, but on the beach, posed for the camera, their lower limbs visible in the flannel dress that the bathing occasion authorized. These photographs were sold as souvenirs. They were purchased and carried home and placed in family albums. They were the Victorian seaside's contribution to the visual economy of the visible female body, photographs that showed what the street kept hidden, authorized by the context of the bathing excursion, preserved in the family album as a record of the holiday. The ankle on the beach was the ankle freed from the architecture of the city. It was the ankle in a different context, under different rules, carrying some of its usual charge, but also something of the holiday's release from the everyday. The Victorian seaside was a place where a little more was permissible, where the rules relaxed slightly, where the wall of concealment admitted a few more gaps than it did at home. The ankle on the beach was not quite the same thing as the ankle on Oxford Street, but it was related to it, and it was interesting in the same way. And the families who kept those photographs in their albums knew what they were keeping. And then, gradually, the wall began to come down, not suddenly, Not in a single season, or a single year, or even a single decade. Walls built over 30 years do not come down quickly, but come down they did, in the end, in the slow and irreversible way that cultural shifts happen, through the accumulation of small changes, each one imperceptible in itself, each one building on the last, until one day you look up and the wall that was there is gone, and the space it occupied is simply open, and it is difficult to remember exactly when the change happened, or to identify the single moment when the change became irrevocable. The process began in the late 1880s and accelerated through the 1890s. The bicycle was part of it, as we have discussed. The rational dress debate was part of it. The growing presence of women in public professional life, as shop girls, as office workers, as teachers, as the growing class of women who worked outside the home not from economic necessity but from choice and ambition, was part of it. The education of women at the new women's colleges of Oxford and Cambridge, the entry of women into the medical and legal professions in small but increasing numbers, all of this was part of the same cultural shift, the same gradual renegotiation of what the female body was, what it was for, and what it was permitted to show. The Edwardian era, the years between Queen Victoria's death in 1901 and the beginning of the First World War in 1914, is often described as a period of loosening, of relaxation from the strictness of the high Victorian era. This is not entirely wrong, but it is not quite right either. The Edwardian period was more comfortable in some respects and more anxious in others. The great social certainties of the mid-Victorian era, the absolute authority of respectability, the unquestioned hierarchy of class, the firm separation of the public male world and the domestic female world, were all under challenge in Edwardian England, and the challenge produced both relaxation and anxiety in roughly equal measure. The Edwardian skirt was not dramatically different from the late Victorian skirt. The hem was still long, the ankle was still mostly hidden, the boot was still buttoned and gleaming and carefully chosen. But the silhouette had changed. The Edwardian skirt was more column-like than the Bustle-era skirt, less structured, less supported by internal frames, fitting more naturally to the body beneath it. And this change in silhouette had consequences for the ankle. The column skirt moving with the body's natural movement rather than the movement of a structured underframe produced a different hem behaviour. It moved more, it revealed more in motion than the stiffer construction of the earlier decades had done. Edwardian fashion plates, the illustrated pages of women's magazines that depicted the season's styles, show this difference clearly. The women in the Edwardian plates are more physically present than their Victorian predecessors. Their posture is less rigidly erect. Their movement, even in the static medium of the illustration, is more fluid. And the hem of the Edwardian skirt in these plates is shown in movement, lifted by the stride, blown back by the wind, gathered up to reveal the boot and occasionally the lower leg, with a confidence that the Victorian illustrations did not quite achieve. The language of ankle description was also changing in the Edwardian period. The private diaries and the social commentary of the 1900s and 1910s show a slightly less oblique engagement with the subject. The ankle can be mentioned not directly, not as an explicit subject of attention, but slightly more directly than it could in 1870. The codes were loosening, the language was adapting, the ankle was becoming very slowly and very gradually a somewhat less charged object, not because it had lost its significance, but because the system that produced its significance was under pressure. The First World War, August 1914. Britain enters the war and everything changes. not immediately visible in the fashion. Fashion does not change overnight in response to the declaration of war. But the war produces changes in the female body's relationship to public space that are, in retrospect, decisive for our story. Women enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Not just the professional work that educated middle-class women had been doing in increasing numbers since the 1880s, but physical, industrial, public work, factory work, transport work, agricultural work, the work of keeping the country running in the absence of the men who have gone to the front. This work requires practical clothing. Practical clothing has a shorter hem. The long skirt that worked in the drawing room or the office was not compatible with the factory floor, the munitions works, the driving of vehicles, the loading of goods. And so, across the years of the war, the hem rose. Not dramatically, not to the knee, not to anything that a woman of 1872 would have found anything other than scandalous. But enough. The walking dress of 1917 or 1918 had a hem 6 inches, sometimes more, above the ground. The ankle was no longer occasionally and accidentally visible. The ankle was simply there, visible, unremarkable, part of the ordinary visual landscape of the street. This change happened with a speed and a completeness that the decades of rational dress debate had not achieved. It happened not because of argument, but because of necessity. The war created a necessity that no social argument had been able to create. The war said, "The practical requirements of this situation demand that women dress differently." And the practical requirements were sufficient justification, in exactly the way that the puddle had been sufficient justification for the briefly raised hem. Except that this time the justification was sustained over years rather than seconds, and the hem, once raised, did not come all the way back down. There is a particular kind of irony in this. The rational dress reformers of the 1880s had argued with considerable sophistication and at considerable personal cost to their reputations for exactly the change that the war simply made happen in the course of a few years of practical necessity. The argument had failed. The necessity succeeded. The Victorian wall of concealment had survived 30 years of deliberate challenge, and then fallen, not to the challenge, but to the requirements of keeping a country running while its men were in France. The post-war woman, the woman of the early 1920s, who arrived at the new decade with the hem at mid-calf or above, with the silhouette looser and more fluid than anything her Victorian grandmother had worn, with a public freedom of movement that the streets of 1872 had not permitted. This woman was the product of the war as much as of any deliberate cultural movement. The war had done what the reformers could not do. It had made the long skirt impractical on such a scale, and for such a sustained period, that the reversion to it afterward was simply not viable. By 1925 the hemline was at the knee. By the late 1920s, in the most fashionable circles it was above the knee. The thing that a Victorian drawing room would have regarded as the complete dissolution of female respectability had happened, and the world had not ended, and respectable women were wearing knee-length skirts on the public street, and nobody, on the whole, was treating this as a catastrophe. The ankle was simply visible. It was just there. It was part of the walking, visible female leg, no more and no less significant than any other part of it. The charge was gone. The ankle had been just the ankle again, for the first time since the 1840s. What does this tell us? I want to take a moment before we close, because I think the story of the Victorian ankle is not just a story about ankles, it is a story about systems, about how systems of meaning are built and maintained and what they do to the people who live inside them. The Victorian ankle was meaningful, genuinely, powerfully meaningful because a system had been built around it. The system was the floor-length skirt. The system was the architecture of Victorian respectability, the careful management of what was shown and what was hidden, the collective social agreement that the female body below the waist was a private and inaccessible world. The ankle was charged because the system charged it. The ankle was significant because the system made it significant. This system was not built to make the ankle significant. The floor-length skirt was not introduced in the 1840s as a deliberate strategy for charging the ankle with cultural meaning. It was introduced because of the history of fashion, because of the social function of modesty, because of the particular anxieties of the Victorian middle classes about respectability and its performance. The ankle significance was a consequence, not a plan, but the consequence was real. The men who watched the women on the street, who noted the ankle in their diaries, who went to the skating pond and the ballroom and the croquet lawn with the particular heightened attention that the system produced, these men were not performing. They were not pretending to find the ankle significant in deference to a social code. They found it genuinely significant because the code had shaped their attention, had trained their perception, had created in them a genuine response to something that, without the code, would have been simply unremarkable. This is how systems of meaning work. They get inside people. They become not just external rules, but internal responses. The Victorian man who experienced the ankle as charged was not a dupe of the system, was not simply following the rules. He was the system, or rather, the system had become part of him, had shaped the way his attention moved through the world, had created the response that he experienced as genuine and spontaneous, because it was genuine and spontaneous, because genuinely spontaneous responses are precisely what systems of meaning produce in the people who live inside them long enough. And this is what makes the story of the Victorian ankle interesting beyond its historical specificity. It is a story about what happens when a system surrounds something, about how meaning is produced not by the thing itself but by the space around it, about how concealment creates significance, and how significance, once created, becomes real in the minds and bodies of the people who experience it, regardless of whether they understand the mechanism that created it. The Victorian ankle was only an ankle, but it was an ankle surrounded by 30 years of systematic concealment, by a wall of fabric and a wall of code and a wall of mutual social agreement, and all of that surrounding, all of that context, all of that history, all of it was there in the 2 seconds of the puddle crossing, in the fraction of an inch of white stocking between the boot and the hem, in the brief, charged, deniable moment that the Victorian street produced over and over for decades. The moment was small. The system that made it was enormous, and the enormous system is what we've been exploring tonight. I want to go deeper for a little while into the experience of the Victorian man in the moment of the glimpse, not the social experience, the performed non-noticing, the deniable awareness, the correct social surface, the actual interior experience, what happened in the 2 seconds of the ankle's visibility in the mind of the man who watched. We have the evidence of the private writings, we have the patterns of the fiction, we have the logic of the system, but I want to try to inhabit the moment itself, not as an exercise in anything improper, but as an exercise in historical imagination, because history is always, at its deepest, an exercise in imaginative empathy. We cannot understand the past without trying to feel it, a little, from the inside. So, a man. Let us call him Thomas, a common enough Victorian name. Thomas is 31 years old. He's a solicitor in a solid provincial firm. He is reasonably prosperous, reasonably intelligent, reasonably content. He has a wife, 2 children, a house in the better part of town with a garden large enough for the children to play in. He attends church on Sunday. He reads the newspapers. He has his fixed habits and his known qualities and his established place in the social world of his town. Thomas is walking home from his office on a Tuesday in October. The afternoon is grey. The street is busy with the usual late afternoon traffic. He's thinking probably about a letter he has to draft tomorrow, or a case he is preparing, or what they are having for dinner, or some small concern that has been sitting at the back of his mind since lunchtime. He is not, in this moment, thinking about anything in particular to do with women's ankles. And then a woman steps around a puddle. She is perhaps 40 feet ahead of him, on the same pavement. She is respectable. Her dress is good quality. Her hat is correctly placed. She's accompanied by a maid carrying a basket. She lifts her skirt an inch, perhaps an inch and a half, to clear the puddle. Her boot appears. The toe, the instep, the side of the ankle, the narrow line of white stocking above the last button. 2 seconds. Then the hem settles, and she walks on. What happens in Thomas? Not in his face. His face shows nothing, because his face never shows anything in public. Not in his walk, which continues with the same measured pace it always has. What happens in the space behind his face? Something happens. We know this because Thomas is a person, and people respond to things, and the system he lives in has trained this response. His attention, which was elsewhere, which was on the letter or the case or the dinner, his attention has moved quickly and completely to the woman ahead. It has registered the ankle. It has, in the 2 seconds available to it, processed a great deal of information. The quality of the boot, the thinness of the ankle, the whiteness of the stocking, the movement of the hem as it settled. This processing has happened quickly and involuntarily, in the way that the trained attention processes the things it has been trained to notice. And then the moment is over, and Thomas's attention drifts back to the letter or the dinner or whatever it was before. But something small has been deposited. Something small has been added to the sediment of Thomas's day that was not there before the puddle, not significant, not distracting, not something that will displace his thoughts of his wife, or his duties or his clients, but something, a small, specific, precise deposit, the boot, the ankle, the white stocking. Thomas will probably not write about this in his diary. It is too small, too ordinary, too much a feature of the daily landscape of the street to be worth recording. But it will be there, in the sediment of the day, when he sits down to write this evening. If he does write anything, it will be something oblique. The afternoon was pleasant, or the walk home agreeable. Something that gestures at a quality of the afternoon without being specific about what that quality consisted of. But perhaps, in a harder winter, when the skating pond is available, when there is more to see and the context is more charged, perhaps Thomas will write something more specific. Miss H skated with particular elegance this afternoon, or the Thornton girls' movement in the waltz this evening was especially graceful, small, oblique, coded, but there. And in that coded writing, in that careful, sideways, precisely managed piece of private record, we can read the whole system. Thomas is not an unusual man. Thomas is not afflicted with any particular obsession, or perversion, or excessive fixation. Thomas is a completely ordinary Victorian man, shaped by the completely ordinary Victorian world, responding to the completely ordinary signals that the completely ordinary Victorian system of meaning produces for the completely ordinary Victorian ankle to deliver. He is the system, and the system made him. Now let us think about the women. We have spent much of tonight's story at the perspective of the Victorian man, what he noticed, what he wrote, what he responded to, what the ankle meant to him, and why. This is partly because the historical record leans that way. More men wrote about the ankle because more men wrote, and the ankle was significant in the specific domain of male visual attention in a way that required writing to document. But the women were there, obviously. The women were the primary participants in every scene we have described. The women walking the street, the women in the ballroom, the women on the skating pond, the women managing the puddle crossing. And they were not passive participants. They were not simply objects of attention, simply bodies being watched. They were people with their own relationship to the system they lived in. Victorian women understood the ankle. They understood it from the inside, which is the more complicated position. They understood it as the one visible part of the lower body, the point of contact between themselves, their clothing, and the watching world. They dressed it carefully. They managed it precisely. They made choices about it that were specific and considered. The boot, as we have discussed, was chosen with great care. But there were other choices too. The management of the hem in public, the precise degree to which the skirt was lifted, in circumstances where lifting was legitimate, was a matter of personal style and social awareness. Women who wanted to show the ankle in the way that was available to them, briefly, legitimately, with external justification, had the means to do so. The puddle could be approached in different ways. The skirt could be lifted slightly more than strictly necessary, or precisely only as much as necessary. The curb could be mounted with the skirt held close, or with the hand releasing slightly earlier. These were choices, micro-choices, made in the space of seconds, invisible to any external observer who could not read the code. But choices nonetheless. Victorian women were not simply the unwitting providers of ankle visibility. Some of them, in some moments, were active participants in its production, working within the rules of the system, using the available latitude, making the most of the circumstances that the legitimate occasions for ankle visibility provided. And they did this in a world that also told them, repeatedly and emphatically, that they should not, that the modest woman did not want to be seen, that the respectable woman did not draw attention to herself, that the correct behavior was to manage the hem with the minimum necessary exposure and to be entirely unconscious of the fact that any exposure had occurred. The Victorian woman navigated this contradiction every day. The system told her that modesty required invisibility. The system also told her that her appearance was the primary measure of her social worth. The system told her that the visible parts of her body should be managed with indifference to male attention. The system also organized male attention very precisely around the one part of her body that was briefly, occasionally, legitimately visible. These are not compatible instructions. They cannot be followed simultaneously. And the Victorian woman found her own individual relationship to the contradiction somewhere between the two poles of the system, in the space that her own character and judgment and desires created. Some Victorian women found the whole business tedious and dressed for practicality, and moved through the world with brusque efficiency, managing their hems because they had to, and thinking no more about it. Some Victorian women understood the system acutely and played it with considerable skill, cultivating an appearance of complete unconsciousness while managing their visible presentation with a precision that the casual observer could not detect. Some Victorian women were actively chafing against the system, the rational dress reformers, the cyclists, the women who wore shorter walking skirts and accepted the social consequences, who were aware that they were challenging something and chose to challenge it anyway. All of these women were real. All of them were there, in the Victorian street and the ballroom and the skating pond. All of them were navigating the same system with different tools and different purposes and different results. The ankle was not only a male experience, it was a shared one. A system that organized male attention around the ankle was simultaneously a system that organized female life around the management of the ankle. The charge flowed both ways. The system enclosed everyone inside it. There is a word I've been using throughout tonight's story, and I want to come back to it before we close. The word is system. A system is not a conspiracy. A system is not something that any one person designed or decided. The Victorian system of concealment was not invented by anyone. It was not the product of a deliberate plan to charge the ankle with significance, or to restrict the female body's visibility, or to produce the particular kind of male attention that the ankle generated. It was the product of thousands of individual choices and social pressures and historical accidents and practical constraints, all accumulating over decades into something that functioned from the inside like a set of rules, but that no one had ever written down or agreed to in any explicit way. This is how most social systems work. They emerge rather than being designed. They arise from the collective behavior of large numbers of people responding to the same incentives and pressures and constraints over time. And once they are established, they are self-maintaining, because everyone inside the system is responding to a world that the system has shaped, and their responses reinforce the system, and the reinforced system shapes more responses, and so on, in the closed loop of social reproduction. The Victorian ankle system maintained itself in this way. The floor-length skirt was fashionable because respectable women wore it, and respectable women wore it because it was fashionable and because it signalled respectability, and respectability was important because the social world organised rewards and punishments around it. Men's attention focused on the ankle because the ankle was the only visible part of the lower body, and the ankle was the only visible part of the lower body because the skirt was floor length, and the skirt was floor length because respectability required it, and respectability required it because, and here the loop closes, because the social world, which included men's behaviour and expectations, demanded it. Everyone was responding to a world they had not made, and in responding making it. This is what systems do. This is why they are so difficult to change from the inside, and why they so often require an outside shock, a war, a technology, an economic disruption, to break the loop. The outside shock for the Victorian ankle system was the First World War. The war broke the loop. The practical necessities of the wartime economy required women to move and work in ways that the floor-length skirt made impossible. The floor-length skirt had to go. The system had to adapt, and in adapting it changed, not just the skirt, but the whole set of meanings and responses and expectations that the skirt sustained. After the war, the ankle was just the ankle. The loop was broken. A new world was beginning with new systems and new charged objects and new walls and new cracks in new walls. But the particular system we've been exploring tonight, the one that made the Victorian ankle what it was over. And in its ending, it becomes visible in a way it never was while it was operating. Systems are invisible from the inside. You cannot see the water when you're in it. The Victorians who lived inside their system of concealment, who responded to the ankle with the responses the system had shaped, who managed their appearances with the care the system required. They could not see the system whole as we can see it now. They experienced its effects without grasping its cause. They felt the charge without understanding the mechanism. They were in the water. We are not in the water. We can look at it from the outside, from a century's distance, with the advantage of history's perspective and the disadvantage of history's remove. We can see the system whole, its construction, its maintenance, its effects on the people inside it, its eventual dissolution. We can trace the ankle's significance from the Regency hem to the 1920s knee, from the emergence of the charge to its dissipation, from the wall to its absence, and in seeing it whole, we can appreciate something that the Victorians could not quite see. How remarkable it is that a joint, a simple anatomical structure connecting two bones in the lower leg, could be made into something of such cultural significance. How remarkable it is that a system of fabric and social agreement could charge an object this small with this much meaning. How remarkable it is that 2 seconds and an inch of white stocking could carry the weight of 30 years of concealment and the whole architecture of Victorian respectability. The ankle was only ever an ankle, but it was an ankle that a whole society across many decades had made into something much larger. A test, a signal, a charged and managed and carefully regulated point of contact between the private and the public, the hidden and the visible, the controlled and the briefly, accidentally, legitimately free. That is remarkable. The Victorians, whatever their limitations, were capable of remarkable things. One last thing before we truly rest. There is something that I've not yet said directly, something that has been threaded through everything we have discussed tonight, but that deserves its own moment at the end. And it is this. The ankle was never only a visual thing. It was also a temporal thing. It existed in time, in the brief duration of the glimpse, in the seconds of the crossing, in the 3 minutes of the waltz's turn, in the sustained exposure of the skating afternoon. The ankle was not a static object to be contemplated. The ankle was a dynamic event to be experienced. It happened, and then it was over, and the happening was the whole of it. This is, I think, the most important thing about the Victorian ankle that we have not quite named. The significance of the ankle was inseparable from its transience. The glimpse was a glimpse, brief, unrepeatable, specific to this moment on this street on this October afternoon. You could not revisit it. You could not study it. You could not examine it at leisure. You had what the moment gave you, and then the moment was gone, and you had the memory of it, which is a different thing. The transience was not incidental to the significance. The transience was the significance, or much of it. An ankle that was available for leisure inspection would not have been the Victorian ankle. An ankle that appeared and remained, that could be looked at as long as one wished, that was present rather than momentary. This ankle would not have been charged with anything. The charge was in the flash. The charge was in the 2 seconds. The charge was in the fact that what appeared immediately disappeared, that the gap in the wall immediately closed, that the hem settled and the puddle was navigated, and the world resumed its normal concealment. The Victorian ankle was, in this sense, a kind of small and quiet event, the same structure as a shooting star or a rainbow, or the sudden appearance of an animal in a wood. It had the particular quality that we associate with things that are beautiful precisely because they are fleeting. It was given its significance partly by its ending. The 2 seconds mattered partly because they were only 2 seconds. And this temporal quality is why the private diary was the appropriate record for the ankle. The diary records events. The diary notes the things that happened on specific days at specific times, and then were over. The diary is the form that best accommodates the transient thing, the thing that existed for a moment and then was gone, but that the writing holds, preserving not the ankle itself but the experience of it, the fact that it happened, the record that it was there. Thomas, walking home on his October Tuesday, did not know that he was part of a historical system, that his response to the ankle was the product of 3 decades of social construction, that the charge he felt in the 2 seconds of the puddle crossing was a charge that 10,000 other men in 10,000 other streets in 10,000 other October afternoons had also felt. He knew only what he felt in the moment as the hem settled and the woman walked on. That moment, personal, specific, temporary and entirely ordinary, was the atomic unit of the Victorian ankle's cultural significance. Not the novels, not the paintings, not the conduct books, not the rational dress debates. Those were the records and the arguments and the codifications. The thing itself was the moment on the street, the moment in the ballroom, the moment on the ice, the moment that came and went and left its small deposit in the sediment of an ordinary Victorian day. And that ordinary Victorian day was composed of hundreds of such moments, most of them unremarkable, some of them small and specific and precisely remembered, a very few of them recorded. The ordinary Victorian day was the medium in which the ankle system operated, not in the abstract, not in the theoretical, in the specific, sensory, temporal experience of individual people moving through specific streets on specific afternoons in specific weather, responding to a world that their culture had shaped for them, with responses that their culture had shaped in them. The ankle was always specific. Always this boot, this stocking, this hem, this puddle, this afternoon. Always this particular woman on this particular pavement in this particular grey October light. The system was general, the ankle was always particular, and the history of the Victorian ankle is, at its heart, the history of those particular moments, the 2 seconds, multiplied across decades, across cities, across the lives of men and women who mostly did not think of themselves as participants in a cultural system, but simply as people going about their lives in the world they found themselves in. That world is gone now, the world in which the floor-length skirt was universal, and the ankle was charged, and the glimpse was everything. It has been gone for 100 years. But the moments it produced, the particular, specific, ordinary, unremarkable moments, those are preserved in the diaries and the novels and the paintings and the photographs in enough detail that we can reconstruct them. We can stand for a while in that October street. We can hear the iron wheels on the stone and smell the coal smoke and watch the women moving through the afternoon. We can understand from the outside what the world they lived in felt like from the inside. That is what history can do at its best. Not explain everything, not resolve every contradiction, but give us the moment, specific, sensory, temporary, and hold it long enough for us to understand what it meant to be there. We were there tonight in a way. That October street was real enough for a while, and the ankle, the particular ankle of our particular afternoon, glimpsed for 2 seconds in the October light, between the gleaming boot and the settling hem, that ankle was real too, in the way that historical things are real when we find them and bring them back into the present, briefly, completely, and then when the light changes and the moment ends, gone again. We're almost at the end. The Victorian ankle was not the end of the story, of course. The 20th century had its own systems, its own walls, its own charged moments. The female body was not liberated into pure, neutral visibility by the rising hemline of the 1920s. New systems replaced old ones. New charged objects replaced the ankle. The history of what was shown and what was hidden continued, as it always continues, in the specific forms that each era creates. But the Victorian ankle had a particular quality, a particular combination of completeness and duration, and cultural investment that makes it worth returning to. It was a charged object that a whole society, across multiple decades, had agreed to take seriously. It was a small thing that a large system had made enormous. It was a joint, the joint between the foot and the leg, that had been made to carry the weight of an entire culture's ideas about the female body, about modesty, about desire, about the boundary between the public and the private, about what could be shown and what must be hidden, and what happened in the gap between. That is a great deal to ask of an ankle, and the ankle, it turns out, was entirely adequate to the task. It bore the weight, it survived the attention. It was exactly what the system needed it to be, small enough to be deniable, specific enough to be noticed, charged enough to matter, rare enough to be remarkable. The puddle was still there, the hem was still long, the boot was still gleaming, and the 2 seconds of the crossing were still everything. Let us rest here for a moment. Let it settle. Let the October street come back, one last time. The grey sky, the coal smoke, the sound of iron wheels on stone. The women moving through the afternoon, erect, contained, their long skirts moving steadily around them, their boots on the wet stone, their hems at the ground. And somewhere in the crowd, a woman steps around a puddle. She lifts her skirt an inch. The boot is visible, the ankle is visible, a thin line of white stocking above the dark leather. 2 seconds, the hem settles, she walks on. The moment is over, the moment was everything. And now you know why. Good night, sleep gently. Let the streets of 1872 be the last thing in your mind tonight. The grey sky, the cold smoke, the warm sound of a city going about its business, the particular quality of light on a damp October afternoon. Let it be quiet, let it slow, let the weight of the day go down, like a hem settling, like a skirt returning to rest, like the gentle, complete, unhurried end of a long autumn afternoon. You were here, you listened, and that too is everything. Good night, Thomas. Good night, London. Good night,